Sometimes the greatest danger comes from the person you think you know, a face you recognize, a voice you trust, someone who's been inside your home, someone you've hired, someone you've helped. It's September 8th, 2010, and for one Kansas woman, an ordinary morning is about to become a nightmare that will change her life forever. Marty Hill had no reason to be afraid that morning. At just 97 pounds, she was a powerhouse at work, known for her reliability and dedication. Her co-workers called her dynamite in a small package. She was the type of person who always showed up, always got things done, always made everything around her better. Which is exactly why, when she didn't show up for the 10 o'clock production meeting at her apparel company, everyone knew something was terribly wrong. The tight-knit group at her workplace had never seen Marty miss a meeting without explanation. She was dependable to a fault. When text messages went unanswered and phone calls went straight to voicemail, concern quickly turned to fear. By 11:30 that morning, a co-worker made the decision to drive to Marty's house. What they found there would launch an investigation that would reveal just how dangerous it can be to trust the wrong person. Marty's car sat in the driveway. Her front door was closed but unlocked. Her purse sat undisturbed on the kitchen table. But Marty was nowhere to be found upstairs. It wasn't until police arrived and ventured into the basement that they discovered the horrifying truth. At the bottom of those basement stairs lay a woman covered head to toe in blood, breathing but barely alive. The amount of blood surrounding her on the floor told a story of unimaginable violence. This wasn't a robbery gone wrong. This wasn't a random break-in. This was something far more personal and infinitely more terrifying. The officer who found her knelt beside the barely conscious woman and asked the question that would drive the entire investigation. Who did this to you? Who did this in those critical moments? As Marty fought for her life, the race was on to find her attacker before they could strike again. When paramedics rushed Marty to the hospital, doctors were stunned by the extent of her injuries. The major veins, skin, and muscle of her left neck had been completely severed. The major artery had multiple scrapes on it, missing complete severance by mere millimeters. Her face was swollen beyond recognition, covered in bruises that spoke to a sustained and vicious beating. The head trauma alone was life-threatening. For the next hour and a half, surgeons worked meticulously to piece together the damage, cleaning and repairing injuries that should have killed her. Even then, doctors remained gravely concerned about brain swelling and the possibility that Marty might not survive the next 24 to 72 hours. Her family arrived at the hospital to find a woman they barely recognized. Marty's eyes were swollen completely shut. Her head was 3 times its normal size. Her teenage daughter later described seeing only her mother's hands and knowing those were the only parts she could still identify. The emotional trauma of seeing their loved one in this condition was almost unbearable. But even as Marty fought for her life in the ICU, investigators were working around the clock to find her attacker. With no signs of sexual assault and no theft from the home, the motive remained a complete mystery. Marty's mother provided crucial information about her daughter's quiet lifestyle. She was a workaholic who rarely left the house except for work. She wasn't dating anyone and kept to herself. The investigation initially focused on Marty's ex-husband, Steve Hill. In cases like this, law enforcement always looks first at those closest to the victim. But Steve was cooperative, providing a detailed account of his activities that day and expressing genuine concern for Marty's well-being. He wanted to find her attacker just as desperately as everyone else did. With Steve cleared as a suspect, investigators found themselves with very limited leads. That's when Marty's mother mentioned B&J Construction, a company that had recently done work on both her home and Marty's. The supervisor, a man named Brian, had seemed like a nice guy, a hard worker, and a family man. Marty's mother had even recommended him based on the quality work he'd done at her house. Brian Pennington was 26 years old and lived in Leeton, Missouri, about an hour and a half from Kansas City. When detectives arrived at his secluded dark house around 9 p.m., they found him polite and cooperative. But something wasn't right. Brian had several fresh scratches on the left side of his face that he claimed came from his dog jumping on him the day before. To the trained eyes of experienced investigators, those scratches didn't look consistent with what a dog would do. Brian kept emphasizing his financial difficulties, claiming there was no way he could have driven to Kansas City because he didn't have money for gas. His young wife, Jessica, backed up his alibi, insisting he'd been home with her the entire time. But when detectives asked to search Brian's clothing for any bloodstains, he readily agreed. What they found in a hamper in the corner of the bathroom would change everything. A pair of jeans near the bottom was covered in red stains, concentrated around the knees and lower portions of the legs. Brian claimed the stains weren't blood, but when detectives rushed the jeans to the crime lab that same night, they tested positive for human blood within 30 minutes. The question now was whose blood it was, and investigators would have to wait several more days for DNA results. The cooperation Brian showed in allowing the search of his home surprised investigators. Most guilty parties don't willingly hand over evidence that could convict them. But perhaps Brian thought the investigation wouldn't go any further, that his word and his wife's alibi would be enough to clear him. Meanwhile, Marty remained in critical condition, unable to communicate with investigators. Doctors were cautiously optimistic, but her recovery was far from certain. The attack had been so brutal, so sustained, that it seemed impossible anyone could survive it. Yet somehow, Marty was fighting back. On the third day after the attack, everything changed. Marty suddenly began to speak, and with her words came the flood of memories from that terrible morning. There was no confusion, no uncertainty in her voice. She knew exactly who had attacked her and why she had opened her door to him that early morning. The man she named would shock everyone who knew him as a trusted contractor, a family man, someone who had been welcomed into homes throughout the community. But appearances, as this case would prove, can be fatally deceiving. As the DNA results came back, confirming that the blood on Brian Pennington's jeans belonged to Marty Hill, investigators realized they were dealing with someone far more dangerous than they had initially imagined. This wasn't a crime of passion or a robbery gone wrong. This was something much darker, and the question that haunted everyone involved was simple: why? Brian Pennington had been in Marty's home before. He'd done work there, earned her trust, been paid for his services. When he knocked on her door that September morning, she had no reason to fear him. She recognized his face, knew his voice, remembered the quality of his work. It was this familiarity that made him so dangerous. According to Marty's recollection, Brian mentioned something about the basement, something he thought she should know about from his previous work there. It seemed reasonable enough. Contractors often remembered details about jobs, noticed things that needed attention. So when he suggested they go downstairs to look at something, Marty led the way. She was 2 steps from the bottom when everything changed. Without warning, without explanation, Brian grabbed her throat with a grip so tight and strong that her voice began to fade. She kept asking what he was doing, but he remained silent. The man who had made pleasant conversation during his work visits now showed no emotion, offered no explanation for the violence he was inflicting. As her voice grew weaker and softer, Marty realized she couldn't speak at all. Then darkness took over, and she lost consciousness. What happened next would be reconstructed by forensic evidence and medical testimony, painting a picture of violence so extreme it defied comprehension. The investigation revealed that after strangling Marty into unconsciousness, Brian didn't stop there. Evidence suggested he then beat her head repeatedly against the concrete basement floor, causing multiple facial fractures and severe brain trauma. The sustained nature of the attack spoke to a level of rage that seemed completely disconnected from any rational motive. But even that wasn't enough. In what prosecutors would later describe as an act of pure evil, Brian then took out a knife and slashed Marty's throat 3 to 4 times, leaving her to die alone in her basement. The cuts were so deep they severed major blood vessels and came within millimeters of completely cutting through her main artery. The crime scene told a story of unimaginable brutality. Blood covered the basement floor from corner to corner. The violence had been so extensive, so sustained, that investigators who had worked hundreds of cases said they'd never seen anything quite like it. This wasn't the work of someone who had lost control in a moment of anger. This was methodical, deliberate, and designed to ensure the victim would not survive. But Brian Pennington had made one critical miscalculation. He believed Marty was dead when he left her basement that morning. He had no way of knowing that this small, seemingly fragile woman possessed a strength that would defy every medical expectation. When investigators arrived at his door that evening, Brian appeared genuinely surprised to learn that Marty was still alive. His cooperation during the initial interview now made perfect sense. If he believed his victim was dead, then there would be no witness to identify him. The scratches on his face could be explained away. The blood on his jeans could be dismissed as something else entirely. He likely thought the investigation would focus elsewhere, perhaps on a stranger or someone with an obvious motive. The DNA evidence changed everything. When the lab confirmed that the blood on Brian's jeans belonged to Marty Hill, investigators knew they had their man, but they still needed to understand the scope of who they were dealing with. Further investigation into Brian's background revealed a pattern of violence that painted a chilling picture of escalation. Records showed Brian had over 60 contacts with law enforcement officers throughout his young life. He had been involved in multiple domestic violence incidents that resulted in injuries to victims. 2 wives, 2 girlfriends, all had experienced his capacity for brutality. For Brian Pennington, beating women wasn't something new or unprecedented. It was a pattern of behavior that had been building towards something catastrophic. The revelation about Brian's history of domestic violence cast his wife Jessica's initial alibi in a different light. When detectives first interviewed her, she had seemed nervous, young, naive. She insisted her husband had been home with her during the entire time frame of the attack. But investigators suspected she was lying to protect him, possibly out of fear of what he might do to her if she told the truth. Jessica was only 20 years old with 2 young children. She had experienced Brian's violence firsthand and knew what he was capable of when crossed. Her initial lie wasn't born of loyalty, but of terror. She understood that cooperating with police could put her own life in danger. When investigators approached Jessica separately, away from her husband's presence, they were able to get her to open up about the truth. They explained to her how severely beaten Marty had been, how close she had come to dying, and how important it was for justice to be served. The human side of Jessica responded to this appeal. In a breakthrough moment for the case, Jessica broke down and admitted she had lied. Brian had not been home with her during the time of the attack. In fact, she revealed that her husband had a history of assaulting and threatening her as well. Her false alibi had been given out of fear, but learning about the extent of Marty's injuries helped her find the courage to tell the truth. Jessica's admission transformed her from a hostile witness protecting her abuser into one of the prosecution's most important allies. Her testimony would prove crucial in establishing that Brian had no alibi for the morning of the attack, and that his pattern of violence against women extended far beyond what happened to Marty. As the case against Brian Pennington solidified, investigators felt confident they could secure a conviction. The DNA evidence was ironclad. Marty's identification was clear and unwavering. Jessica's recanted testimony eliminated Brian's alibi. The scratches on his face corroborated a physical struggle. Everything pointed to one inescapable conclusion, but the question that haunted everyone involved in the case remained unanswered. Why had Brian Pennington decided to brutally attack a woman who had hired him, paid him fairly, and treated him with respect? There had been no theft from Marty's home. Money and valuables were left untouched. There was no evidence of sexual assault, no history of conflict or disagreement between them. The randomness of the violence was perhaps its most terrifying aspect. If Brian could attack Marty without any apparent motive, then no one who had ever hired him or interacted with him was truly safe. The realization sent shockwaves through the community and raised uncomfortable questions about how well we really know the people we invite into our homes and lives. For Marty's family, the arrest brought a mixture of relief and continued anguish. Relief that the monster who had nearly killed their loved one was behind bars. Anguish over the senseless nature of the crime and the long road to recovery that still lay ahead. The physical healing was only the beginning. The emotional and psychological trauma would take much longer to address. Marty herself faced the daunting prospect of rebuilding her life from the ground up. The brain injury had affected her balance, her vision, her hearing, her memory, and her ability to process information normally. Simple tasks that had once been automatic now required conscious effort and concentration. The strong, capable woman who had been known for her reliability and competence now struggled with basic functions, yet even as she fought to regain her physical abilities, Marty demonstrated the same determination that had kept her alive through the attack. With the support of her family and medical team, she began the slow process of recovery, knowing that her survival and her willingness to testify would be crucial to ensuring Brian Pennington faced justice for his crimes. The legal proceedings that followed would test everyone involved in ways they never imagined. Brian Pennington was charged with attempted first-degree murder, and the prosecution was determined to see him serve the maximum sentence allowed under law. The evidence seemed overwhelming, but in the American justice system, even the most clear-cut cases can take unexpected turns. As preparations for trial began, the prosecution team faced a critical decision about how to present their case. The DNA evidence on Pennington's genes was powerful, but they knew defense attorneys would try to create reasonable doubt wherever possible. The lack of a clear motive remained problematic, giving the defense room to argue that perhaps someone else had committed the crime. Marty's recovery continued slowly but steadily. The woman who had once been known for her sharp mind and quick wit now struggled with basic cognitive functions. Her speech was sometimes unclear, her memory had gaps, and her physical coordination remained impaired. The prosecution worried whether she would be strong enough to testify, and whether a jury would find her testimony credible given her brain injury. But Marty possessed something that no amount of physical trauma could destroy: an unshakable determination to see justice done. She worked tirelessly with speech therapists and physical rehabilitation specialists, driven by the knowledge that her testimony could be the key to putting her attacker behind bars. Her children watched in amazement as their mother fought to reclaim pieces of herself that had been stolen in those terrible minutes in her basement. The preliminary hearing arrived with tremendous anticipation and anxiety. This would be the first time Marty would face her attacker in a courtroom setting, and no one knew how she would react. The stakes couldn't have been higher. If the prosecution failed to convince the judge there was sufficient evidence to proceed to trial, Pennington would walk free. When Pennington was brought into the courtroom, the contrast was stark. He sat alone on his side of the room, with no family members present to support him. Not even his mother had come. He stared straight ahead, showing no emotion, until Marty entered the courtroom. Only then did his head turn, his eyes following her slow, deliberate walk to the witness stand. Those who witnessed that moment described it as chilling. Pennington's expression seemed to convey disbelief that his victim was not only alive, but walking into court to testify against him. The ghost he thought he had created was very much real and very much determined to see him pay for what he had done. Marty's testimony was powerful in its simplicity. Despite her injuries and the trauma she had endured, her identification of Pennington was clear and unwavering. She looked directly at him as she spoke, showing a courage that inspired everyone in the courtroom. Her voice may have been weaker than before, but her words carried the weight of absolute truth. The prosecution's case was further strengthened when Jessica Pennington took the stand. Her decision to tell the truth about her husband's whereabouts that morning was crucial, but it came at great personal cost. She knew that by testifying against him, she was putting herself and her children at risk of retaliation. Yet she found the strength to do what was right. The judge ruled that there was sufficient evidence to proceed to trial. But as the case moved forward, unexpected developments began to emerge. Pennington's defense team, recognizing the strength of the evidence against their client, began exploring the possibility of a plea agreement. The prospect of facing a jury with DNA evidence, victim identification, and witness testimony seemed daunting even to experienced defense attorneys. Negotiations between the prosecution and defense stretched on for months. The central question was how much time Pennington would serve in prison. The prosecution wanted to ensure he would be locked away for as long as legally possible, while the defense sought to minimize his sentence. For Marty and her family, the uncertainty was agonizing. Eventually, both sides reached an agreement. Pennington would plead guilty to the charges against him in exchange for a sentence of 28.5 years in prison. For the prosecution, it guaranteed a significant prison term without the uncertainty of a jury trial. For Marty, it meant she wouldn't have to endure the grueling process of a full trial and could begin to find some closure. But even this resolution would not come without drama. On the day of sentencing, as family members prepared to deliver victim impact statements, Pennington shocked everyone by attempting to withdraw his guilty plea. After weeks of accepting responsibility for his actions, he suddenly claimed the pressure was too much and the sentence too long. The judge was having none of it. Pennington's reasons for wanting to withdraw his plea were deemed insufficient, and the sentencing proceeded as planned. One by one, Marty's family members stood before the court to tell Pennington exactly how his actions had affected their lives. Her teenage daughter's statement was particularly powerful. She looked directly at Pennington as she spoke about the trauma of seeing her mother in the hospital, about the fear that had consumed their family, about the strength they had found in each other. Even though Pennington refused to look at her, she knew he was hearing every word. Then came the moment everyone had been waiting for. Marty herself stood before the man who had tried to kill her. Her voice was steady as she spoke about his betrayal of her trust, about the pain he had caused not just to her, but to everyone who loved her. She asked him the question that had haunted her since that terrible morning. "Why did you do this to me?" Pennington's response was silence. Even given the opportunity to explain his actions, to show some remorse, to offer some understanding of what had driven him to such violence, he chose to say nothing. That silence spoke volumes about the kind of person he truly was. The judge sentenced Brian Pennington to 28.5 years in the Kansas state prison system. He would have to serve at least a significant portion of that sentence before becoming eligible for parole. For a man who had lived only 26 years, the prospect of spending more time behind bars than he had spent as a free man was sobering. Today, Marty Hill continues her recovery, forever changed, but never broken by what happened to her. The scars on her neck serve as a constant reminder of how close she came to death, but they also represent her incredible survival. She has returned to kickboxing, pushing herself physically as part of her ongoing rehabilitation. The woman who once weighed 97 pounds and was known as dynamite in a small package has proven that some forces of nature cannot be extinguished. Her story serves as a chilling reminder that evil can wear a familiar face, that danger can come from the most unexpected sources. Brian Pennington wasn't a stranger lurking in shadows. He was someone Marty knew, someone she had trusted, someone she had welcomed into her home. That betrayal of trust makes his crime even more heinous, and her survival even more remarkable. The question of motive may never be fully answered. Pennington's silence has left his victim and her family without the closure that understanding might bring. But perhaps that's fitting. Some acts of violence are so senseless, so devoid of rational explanation, that trying to understand them is futile. What matters is that justice was served, that a dangerous predator was removed from society, and that a remarkable woman found the strength to survive and rebuild her life. In the end, this case reminds us all to be vigilant, to trust our instincts, and to remember that sometimes the greatest threats come from those we least suspect. The stranger you know may be the most dangerous stranger of all. Sports often presents us with moments that go beyond the scoreboard, moments that reveal deeper, sometimes darker, aspects. This isn't about the game-winning shot, the championship, or the fairy tale. This is about a powerful man, a video that holds more secrets than the camera can capture, and a nation's reflection on the culture behind it. It all started as a normal basketball practice at Rutgers University. Sneakers clicked on the floor, whistles blared in the gym, young players busily practicing and chasing their dreams. At the center of it all was head coach Mike Rice, strong, authoritative, and fierce. But behind the walls of the gym, something unusual happened. A video emerged. It was grainy and low quality, but its contents were unmistakable. Coach Mike Rice yelling at players, throwing basketballs at their heads and groins, grabbing their jerseys, kicking them, and shouting profanities. His behavior was no longer encouragement or love, but outright abuse, captured in disturbing detail. Then came the slurs. Homophobic insults hurled across the gym, directed at teenage athletes. At Rutgers, where such language carried a painful history, the words cut deeper than any physical harm. When the video leaked to the public, it spread rapidly, sparking outrage. Parents, students, alumni, and people everywhere were appalled. Calls for Mike Rice's firing dominated news cycles. Politicians spoke out. Even comedy shows like The Daily Show and Saturday Night Live mocked him. But beneath the satire, a serious conversation began to emerge. Was Mike Rice just a single bad coach? Or was his behavior evidence of a more systemic problem in sports culture? Up until then, Mike Rice was an obscure figure outside collegiate basketball. Overnight, he became a symbol of toxic coaching, unchecked power, and what happens when winning at all costs overshadows basic decency. New Jersey Governor Chris Christie voiced the nation's disbelief, saying that if Mike Rice had been Kobe Bryant's coach, he would have smacked the hell out of him. Soon, parents everywhere were asking a haunting question whether they would let that man coach their child. As the scandal erupted, Mike Rice vanished from the public eye, left to deal with the consequences, professionally, personally, and emotionally. He was fired, his reputation destroyed. At home, he faced his wife and children, knowing he had let them down. This story wasn't just about punishment. It became a reflection on anger, ego, toxic culture, and regret. And perhaps, in some ways, redemption. But if redemption was possible, it wouldn't come easily or quickly. Because some mistakes leave marks that time, and even apologies cannot erase. Before he became infamous as the coach who crossed the line, Mike Rice was just a kid who loved basketball. The sport was practically in his DNA. His mother had been a star college player, and his father, Mike Rice Sr., was a former coach and well-known NBA broadcaster. Mike Sr. was famously fiery, so much so that he remains the only NBA broadcaster ever ejected from a game, tossed out for arguing with a referee from the announcer's table. In the Rice household, basketball wasn't just a pastime, it was a way of life. The game shaped family dinners, fueled debates, and ignited passion. It wasn't seen as toxic. It was simply part of who they were. Mike Rice seemed destined to follow in his family's footsteps. He played college basketball and slowly climbed the coaching ladder. His journey was not an overnight success. Starting at smaller programs, he moved from assistant coaching roles to head coach positions, earning a reputation for relentless effort and intense dedication to the game. He was focused, determined, hungry. However, unchecked intensity can sometimes take a darker turn. Mike got his first taste of success at Robert Morris University, a small school in western Pennsylvania, where he transformed a struggling basketball team into a winner. Under his leadership, Robert Morris enjoyed a 3-year winning streak and earned a spot in the NCAA tournament. His energy and intensity were central to this turnaround. Practices were tough, often harder than the games. Mike believed that this pressure would build resilience, pushing his players to, and sometimes beyond, their limits. In the small school environment, with less media scrutiny and fewer critics, Mike's demanding style flourished. But success brought attention, and in 2010 he was hired as the head basketball coach at Rutgers University. Along with a 6-figure salary, Mike was given a daunting task to transform the struggling program in one of the country's premier conferences, the Big East. The pressure was immense. Rutgers had been stuck at the bottom of the Big East standings for years, and the program needed revitalization. Mike promised to provide that spark. At first, he appeared to deliver, injecting new energy and demanding more from his players. But away from the public eye, his intense methods started to raise concerns. At home, Mike's wife, Kathy, picked up on warning signs early: his language, anger, and emotional outbursts. She frequently addressed it with him, but the behavior didn't change. In Mike's mind, his methods weren't abusive. They were meant to prepare players for the harsh realities of basketball and life. He believed his intensity built toughness. To him, if his players couldn't handle his criticism, how would they handle high-pressure moments in games? He failed to realize he had already crossed a line on the court. Mike's temper became more apparent. He often yelled at referees, berated players, and even drew technical fouls. During one particularly heated game against Louisville, Mike was ejected. Alarmed by his behavior, the director asked him why. If he was such a great coach, he kept embarrassing the university. Mike saw it differently. Later, he said that he hadn't had an anger problem and that it was a myth. He explained that he had a control problem and had lost control, emphasizing that there was a difference. However, he ignored warnings from his wife, his bosses, and even his assistant coaches, all of whom had tried to curb his destructive behavior. Driven by his ambition to prove himself, Mike became increasingly tunnel-visioned, losing sight of the purpose of coaching. For a time, Mike's methods were overlooked because winning seemed to matter more than how he achieved it. Rutgers didn't fire him, choosing instead to wait and hope his behavior would improve. However, behind the scenes, someone was already taking action. Eric Murdoch, a former NBA player and assistant coach at Rutgers, had collaborated closely with Mike for many years. After Rutgers chose not to renew Eric's contract, he made a fateful decision, reviewing hours of internal practice footage, a public record since Rutgers is a state school. Eric compiled the worst examples of Mike's abusive behavior into a video and handed it over to the administration. That act set off a countdown to Mike's firing and the national scandal that would follow. Mike Rice came to Rutgers in 2010 as an unpolished but hungry coach who had transformed a small program into a winner. Unlike coaches with prestigious backgrounds or legendary mentors, Mike was scrappy and determined to prove he belonged. In a college sports culture fixated on immediate success, that hunger was enough for him to land the job. Rutgers needed change. After years of failure, the program had lost its fan base, student support, and financial backers. Mike promised to reignite passion, deliver results, and break the team out of its slump. At first, it appeared he might succeed, but his harmful methods ultimately overshadowed any progress he had made. From day one, he attacked his job with urgency. His approach was intense. He pushed players relentlessly, shouting and demanding more, never satisfied. He wasn't a quiet or constructive coach. Instead, he screamed, cursed, and berated. Miss a defensive rotation, you'd get an earful. Fail a drill, you'd run it again and again, until you collapsed. Initially, some players respected his intensity, believing he was toughening them up, preparing them for pressure and the realities of life. They would say that was just how the coach was, and that he was old school. But his old school methods quickly crossed the line, repeatedly and behind closed doors. In the practice facility, his behavior escalated. He threw basketballs at players, sometimes at their legs, sometimes at their heads. He shoved them, yanked their jerseys, and hurled slurs, using homophobic insults like faggots, fairies, and sissies. He mocked and humiliated players. This wasn't an occasional lapse. It was systematic and ongoing abuse. This wasn't leadership. This was assault disguised as coaching. And the worst part, everyone saw it. Eric Murdoch, a former NBA player and respected figure in basketball, joined Mike's staff as the director of player development. At first, he supported Mike's vision, but what he witnessed shocked him. Disturbed, Eric started documenting the abuse. As a public university, Rutgers recorded all official team practices and stored the video footage. Eric sifted through hours of archived tape, compiling a reel of damning evidence. That reel would ultimately expose everything. But within the program, a toxic culture protected Mike. Despite numerous complaints, warnings, and internal reviews, no one stopped him. The athletic department knew. The university president knew. Some staff members spoke out, but their concerns were dismissed or ignored. Why? Because firing a head coach wasn't just a disciplinary decision, It was a financial one. Mike's contract included a substantial buyout. Firing him could cost Rutgers over $1 million. So they tried to manage the issue quietly, issuing a fine, suspending him for a few games, and requiring anger management classes. They gave no public explanation, no transparency. Meanwhile, the players were trapped. Many were on scholarships. Their future opportunities depended on staying in the coach's good graces. Speaking out could mean losing playing time, support, or even their spot on the team. Some transferred to other schools. Some stayed silent. A few tried to justify what was happening. The abuse continued. Mike didn't think he was doing anything wrong. In his mind, he was molding boys into men. Breaking them down would make them stronger. He saw himself as tough but fair. Having grown up in a household where yelling was normal and passion was loud, he didn't believe he was crossing any lines, but he ignored the signals, his staff's concerns, his family's warnings, and the quiet suffering of his players. Mike's wife, Kathy, had been begging him to change for years. After games, she would point to footage on TV, showing him his rage-filled face and choice of words. She urged him to think about their children, who were starting to hear rumors. But Mike dismissed her. In his mind, his methods would be validated by results. But the results weren't coming. Rutgers wasn't improving. Mike's win-loss record remained unimpressive, and the pressure on him grew. Boosters demanded more success. The athletic department became uneasy. With every outburst, he became harder to defend. And then, things finally reached a breaking point. After Rutgers chose not to renew Eric Murdoch's contract, he handed over the practice footage he had compiled to the athletic department again. This time, he delivered a clear ultimatum if action wasn't taken. He would make sure the footage became public. For months, no action was taken. Then, on April 2nd, 2013, ESPN's Outside the Lines released the footage to the public. What followed left America stunned. The videos revealed Rutgers basketball coach Mike Rice cursing, throwing balls at players' heads, hurling slurs, and physically grabbing athletes mid-practice. These weren't isolated incidents. The footage included dozens of clips, spliced together. They painted a horrifying picture of a coach completely out of control. The reaction was instantaneous and overwhelming. Social media exploded. News outlets replayed the footage non-stop. Sports radio slammed Rutgers for protecting Mike. Journalists began questioning who knew about the abuse and when. Students protested. Alumni threatened to cut off donations. Parents of players expressed their outrage. Within 24 hours, Mike Rice was fired, but the damage had already been done. The scandal quickly escalated. Rutgers athletic director Tim Pernetti, who had decided not to fire Mike earlier, resigned. The university's general counsel stepped down. The president of Rutgers faced intense criticism. Everyone involved in keeping the abuse under wraps was now under investigation. This was no longer just about Mike. It exposed deeper issues within college athletics. A culture that prioritized winning over player welfare. A system where money outweighed morality. A tradition where young athletes, many still teenagers, were expected to stay silent about mistreatment. Mike disappeared from public view, becoming synonymous with disgrace. Many of his players moved on, though some carried emotional scars from their time under his volatile leadership. Some forgave him, but others refused to speak with him again. In the following months, Mike sought help. He entered anger management, met with therapists, and began volunteering with high schools and youth sports leagues. He tried to rebuild himself and his reputation, quietly and slowly. But for many, it was far too late. The footage couldn't be erased, and the memories of his behavior couldn't be unseen. The scandal revealed what Mike was really like behind closed doors, who he truly was when no one was supposed to be watching. Mike built his career on fiery intensity, but ultimately destroyed it through cruelty. The same culture that once celebrated his passion was now responsible for his fall. In early April 2013, the footage went viral. Grainy practice clips shot inside Rutgers' basketball facility were broadcast nationwide by ESPN's Outside the Lines. Within hours, the videos were everywhere, on Twitter, Facebook, news channels, and YouTube. Almost overnight, it seemed like the entire country had seen what was never meant to be public. No narration or commentary was necessary. The footage said it all. The clips showed Mike stalking the gym floor, his face red with rage and veins bulging as he screamed insults. He hurled basketballs at players with force. One incident showed a ball bouncing off a player's head, another ricocheting off a leg. The videos captured him lunging at players, grabbing them, and shouting slurs like faggots, sissies, and motherfuckers. Every word echoed like a weapon in the gym. This was far more than intensity. It was outright abuse, and the entire world saw it, from homes to dorm rooms to break rooms across the nation. People watched the footage in disbelief. Some shook their heads in disgust. Others turned away, while some replayed the video just to reassure themselves they hadn't misinterpreted what they saw. The media responded immediately. Overnight, Mike became a national disgrace. He wasn't just a bad coach. He was that coach, the one who bullied and humiliated his players on camera. ESPN analysts dissected the video. Late-night comedians mocked him, and public figures joined in to condemn him. Famous athletes like Charles Barkley, LeBron James, and Magic Johnson weighed in. Even coaches known for their strictness and discipline agreed that Mike had crossed every line imaginable. The fallout continued at Rutgers. Within a day of the footage going public, the university was in chaos. The outcry was deafening. Students protested in the streets of New Brunswick, demanding accountability. Outraged parents called into local radio stations, furious that their children had been subjected to Mike's treatment. Alumni threatened to end their financial support of the university. The scandal had spilled far beyond the gym. It wasn't just about Mike anymore. It was about the broken culture of college sports. The phones at the president's office were ringing non-stop. Reporters set up camp outside the athletic department. Board members scrambled to hold emergency meetings. At the center of the chaos was Tim Pernetti, the athletic director who had seen the footage months earlier, but chose not to fire Mike Rice. It was soon obvious that this wasn't a case of a university blindsided by new revelations. Rutgers had already known. The video had been submitted months prior, and internal meetings had taken place. Mike had been suspended for 3 games, fined $75,000, and ordered to attend anger management. But the video itself was kept under wraps. Now, that decision seemed like a deliberate cover-up. Tim Pernetti released a public statement saying that he had always tried to do what was right. But in that case, he regretted not taking stronger action sooner. His statement did little to control the damage, but by then, the damage was done. The entire Rutgers athletic program was under intense scrutiny. Critics questioned the university's leadership, its values, and the culture that allowed such behavior to go unchecked. Even New Jersey Governor Chris Christie weighed in, calling the video footage appalling and stating Mike should have been fired immediately. The scandal reached beyond Rutgers, prompting colleges nationwide to re-examine their policies and oversight. If such behavior could happen, and be documented. At Rutgers, what might be happening behind closed doors elsewhere? Meanwhile, Eric Murdoch, the whistleblower who turned in the tape, sparked mixed reactions. Some hailed him as a hero for exposing the toxic culture, while others accused him of acting out of spite after his contract wasn't renewed. Eric dismissed the accusations, saying in interviews that he hadn't done it for revenge, but because he believed it was wrong. He stated that what Mike did to those players was not how human beings should be treated. As the media frenzy slightly subsided in the weeks that followed, the consequences of the scandal continued to unfold. Former players' parents began speaking out, revealing that their sons came home emotionally drained. Some admitted they had advised their children to stay quiet, not wanting to risk losing their scholarships. Other players, like former Rutgers guard Derek Randall, shared first-hand accounts of how Mike's abusive behavior left lasting scars. Some players defended Mike, saying he pushed them to improve and wasn't a bad person. But the footage painted a stark picture. The line had been crossed, time and time again. As for Mike, he eventually broke his silence in a televised interview, admitting that he had been wrong. He said he had no excuse, that he had lost control, let his emotions take over, and let down the people he cared about most. Mike didn't try to justify his behavior or shift blame. He acknowledged that he had failed as a leader, and he said the most painful part of it all was facing his children's disappointment. Mike described his therapy sessions as the most difficult experience of his life. Week after week, he was forced to watch the tape, not as a coach, but as a father, husband, and human being. Over time, Mike Rice started volunteering with youth basketball programs. He led clinics, mentored young players, and gave speeches about emotional control and the power of words. Some viewed these actions as genuine growth, while others saw them as an attempt to repair his reputation. Regardless of intent, the scandal cast a lasting shadow. The Rutgers basketball program struggled to recover. Recruiting efforts faltered, players transferred, morale plummeted, and the university spent years working to rebuild trust with students, families, and donors alike. The NCAA, already criticized for other issues, faced renewed scrutiny over its lack of oversight and the treatment of student athletes. Lawmakers pushed for reforms aimed at protecting athletes from abusive coaching. Some schools introduced stricter reporting systems, while others quietly re-examined their own programs, hoping to avoid a similar controversy. Yet despite these reforms, one fundamental truth remained: no policy. Training, or code of conduct, can stop abuse without individuals stepping up to confront it when they see it. The Rutgers case wasn't just about a coach losing his temper. It exposed a system that enabled and protected him while silencing those who tried to speak out. Mike didn't just betray his players. The institution failed them as well. That's why the video was so shocking. It wasn't just the disturbing footage. It was the years of silence, excuses, fear, money, and a toxic culture that allowed this behavior to thrive behind closed doors. In a televised interview, Mike issued a public apology, not to save his career, which was nearly destroyed, but to explain what had driven him to that point. He admitted that he had been out of control and that he had let his competitive drive override his values. He also confessed that he had coached through fear and anger, and that wasn't the kind of person he wanted to be. He didn't cry or plead for forgiveness. He didn't offer excuses. Instead, he took responsibility for his actions, acknowledging the pain he caused, especially to his players. Still, many remained skeptical. Some dismissed his remorse as calculated and insincere, a case of too little, too late. After all, how could someone who hurled slurs one year claim personal transformation the next? Former players were divided. Some privately spoke of enduring trauma, panic attacks, mistrust of authority, and memories of practices burned into their minds. Others defended Mike, arguing that he never intended harm and had helped them grow tougher and more focused. Yet even his supporters couldn't ignore the undeniable truth captured on video. This wasn't speculation. It was documented abuse. Rutgers didn't forgive him. The NCAA didn't welcome him back. No other programs reached out. His name became toxic. Parents didn't want him around their kids. Colleges avoided dealing with the questions his presence would raise. So Mike started over. Not with college athletes, but with kids. He began volunteering at youth basketball camps, arriving in old sneakers and a simple t-shirt, no fancy title, no paycheck, just a whistle, a gym full of middle schoolers, and a chance to begin again with those too young to know the scandal. He taught them drills and ran warm-ups. He shared stories but also spoke about emotions, pressure, and how yelling isn't leadership. He reminded the kids that their worth wasn't tied to how many points they scored, but how they treated their teammates. Over time, some parents began to trust him with their kids. A few stayed wary, keeping their distance. But Mike wasn't asking for redemption. He just kept showing up. Back home, his wife, Kathy, stayed by his side. She had always been his voice of reason. While she didn't excuse his actions, she didn't leave him. Their family, deeply affected by the public shame, focused on healing. Their son, once teased and humiliated at school, began talking about forgiveness. Their daughter, who initially refused to watch the footage, started attending clinics again. This time, she saw her father differently, not as the man who lost control, but someone working to regain it. Still, the past lingered. In gyms or grocery stores, people sometimes recognized him. They whispered, pointed fingers, and occasionally confronted him. Some stayed silent, offering only a look that said everything. Mike didn't argue or make excuses in those moments, but acknowledged it, telling a friend that he had earned that and all he could do now was try to be better. As the years went by, the scandal faded from public attention. Headlines focused on new controversies, new scandals, and new villains. But for Mike, it never really ended. It stayed with him in therapy sessions, family dinners, and the quiet moments at kids' basketball camps between drills. He never coached college basketball again. He didn't aim for national recognition. He never even tried. Instead, he kept rebuilding, not for public opinion or media redemption, but for the people closest to him. The ones he faced every day. The ones who mattered the most. This wasn't about fixing his reputation. It was about accepting responsibility. And that is the difference between regret and true remorse. The Mike scandal didn't end with his firing. It sparked a reckoning. It forced college athletics to reevaluate the line between being a tough coach and being abusive. It revealed how some institutions prioritize image over accountability. It reminded everyone that behind every player, behind every jersey and scholarship, is a human being who deserves respect, not just discipline. Mike never returned to the college basketball stage. His name remains tied to a pivotal moment when private misconduct was dragged into public view. His story didn't fade, though. It exists in policy changes, coaching workshops, and in the tougher questions administrators now ask about what happens out of public sight. For his former players, the story leaves a personal legacy. Some carry scars, some carry lessons, but all lived through a moment that reshaped the sport and their coach. For Mike, redemption isn't a goal to achieve. It's a lifelong process of repair. The tape doesn't lie, but what a person does after the tape stops, how they take responsibility, how they change, that's the part that's harder to see. George Michael Zimmerman was born on October 5, 1983 in Manassas, Virginia. He was the third of 4 children in a family that blended different cultural backgrounds. His father, Robert Zimmerman Sr., a retired military officer and magistrate, was of German descent, while his mother, Gladys Zimmerman, was born in Peru and worked as a court interpreter. Their family is modest, but still maintains traditional values. From a young age, George was raised with a sense of discipline, community service, and civic responsibility. He was quiet, even withdrawn, in school. He struggled academically, but made up for it with a strong sense of loyalty and structure. After graduating from high school, he moved to Florida with vague, undefined dreams. He studied at Seminole State College intermittently, working small jobs, one as an insurance underwriter and another in a car dealership, before eventually settling into a role as a security officer for a gated community. He also volunteered with the Neighborhood Watch, viewing it not just as a task, but a responsibility. Friends and neighbors described him as someone who wanted to help, who sometimes took things too seriously, and who clearly admired law enforcement. George had, at points, voiced aspirations of becoming a police officer. He attended community forums, signed up for citizen police academies, and familiarized himself with Florida law. He wasn't in uniform, but he carried the demeanor of someone who believed he was serving and protecting. His past, however, included some red flags: an arrest for assaulting an undercover officer, a charge later dropped after completing a diversion program, and a restraining order filed during a dispute with an ex-fiancée. Nevertheless, George always considered himself a man of order and discipline. In 2009, he married Shelley, a licensed cosmetologist. The couple lived in a rented townhouse in the Retreat at Twin Lakes, a mixed-race gated community in Sanford, Florida. Though George lacked formal authority, he often took it upon himself to patrol his neighborhood, especially after a string of break-ins had left many residents uneasy. He obtained a concealed weapons permit and began carrying a Kel-Tec 9mm pistol. For him, safety was paramount, and something he felt personally charged to ensure. Trayvon Martin, born February 5, 1995 in Miami, Florida, was the youngest son of Sabrina Fulton and Tracy Martin. Although his parents were separated, they remained cooperative and respectful in raising their children, with a primary focus on their son. Trayvon split his time between his mother's home in Miami Gardens and his father's home in Sanford, often visiting extended family on school breaks and holidays. Trayvon is curious, energetic, and brings warmth and positivity to those around him. At 17, he loved playing video games, participating in sports, listening to rap music, and once expressed his dream of becoming a pilot in school. Trayvon sometimes got into trouble. He had been suspended multiple times, including once for the possession of a small amount of a banned substance. His family admitted he made mistakes, but pointed out that he was just like any other teenage boy still navigating the transition from adolescence to adulthood. While he wasn't perfect, he wasn't dangerous either. In February 2012, Trayvon was staying in Sanford with his father's fiancée, Brandy Green. His father hoped the change of pace would be good for him, a reset of sorts. Trayvon was familiar with the area, comfortable in the Retreat at Twin Lakes community. Like many boys his age, he regularly texts, listens to music and calls his friends. One of those friends, a young woman named Rachel Jontel, would later say that Trayvon had been nervous that week, worried about a man who was watching him. George and Trayvon came from vastly different backgrounds, shaped by distinct experiences, values, and circumstances. Yet, on the night of February 26, 2012, their lives intersected in a gated community in Sanford, Florida. This chance meeting would spark a national conversation, disrupt a quiet town, and leave a lasting impact on America. What began as an ordinary Sunday in the retreat at Twin Lakes, a neighborhood of neatly trimmed hedges and uniformed townhomes, took a tragic turn. A light rain fell over the area, and the streets were mostly quiet. Behind this calm, however, tensions were simmering within the community after a string of recent burglaries. Nervous residents whispered about unfamiliar faces, and George Zimmerman, a 28-year-old neighborhood watch captain, took it upon himself to act. George regularly patrolled the area, logging numerous calls to authorities about suspicious activity. Armed with a legally concealed 9mm handgun, he saw his role as a protector, shouldering what he believed others would not. At 7:09 p.m., George spotted a young man walking slowly in the rain and called the non-emergency police line. He reported the individual looked suspicious and up to no good. His description, a teenager in a dark hoodie and jeans. Frustration crept into his voice as he added, "These assholes, they always get away." When asked by the dispatcher if he was following the person, George confirmed he was. The dispatcher advised that they didn't need him to do that. But George had already exited his vehicle and followed the young man on foot. The man George was tracking was 17-year-old Trayvon Martin. That evening, Trayvon had walked to a nearby 7-Eleven to buy Arizona fruit juice and Skittles. On his way back, with his hoodie up to keep out the drizzle, he was on the phone with a friend, Rachel Jontel. Their conversation was lighthearted, but took a worried tone when Trayvon mentioned someone was following him. Rachel urged him to run, and he did. Then George and Trayvon come face to face, a moment filled with uncertainty. By 7:16 p.m., neighbors began calling 911, reporting a physical struggle. In the background of these frantic calls, shouts for help could be heard, followed by a gunshot. When police arrived, Trayvon was found lying face down in the grass, a fatal gunshot wound to his chest. He was pronounced dead at the scene. Nearby, George stood with minor injuries, a bloody nose and abrasions on his head. According to George, Trayvon had attacked him, punched him, and reached for his gun, fearing for his life. George said he fired in self-defense. His firearm was still in its holster when officers arrived. George was questioned but released the same night. Initially, the case garnered little attention. The police categorized the shooting as a self-defense incident, citing Florida's Stand Your Ground law, which allows individuals to use deadly force if they reasonably believe their life is in danger, with no obligation to retreat. For the Sanford police, this explanation appeared sufficient. No arrest was made. However, for Trayvon's parents, and eventually much of the nation, this outcome was unacceptable. The events of that night and their consequences sparked an intense and divisive national debate. In the aftermath of Trayvon's death, his parents, Tracy and Sabrina, demanded answers. Why hadn't there been an arrest? Why was no one held accountable for their son's death? Their voices grew louder as they appeared on news programs, held press conferences, and shared images of Trayvon, a smiling, affectionate teenager who dreamed of becoming a pilot. Public outrage began to build, and the community became deeply divided. For many, This wasn't just a local tragedy, but a national crisis. Trayvon was young, black, and unarmed. George was older, armed, and had been advised not to pursue Trayvon. To a significant portion of the public, the facts were painfully clear. Trayvon's hoodie became a powerful symbol of injustice. Protests erupted nationwide, with students walking out of schools and marches held from Harlem to Los Angeles, all chanting justice for Trayvon. The Sanford Police Department faced harsh criticism. Chris Serino, the case's original lead investigator, expressed doubts about George's account, even testifying later that George could have avoided the encounter altogether. However, other officers disagreed, leading to division within the department and the broader community over the decision not to arrest George. The release of the 911 tapes became a tipping point. The background of the calls included desperate cries for help, analyzed repeatedly by experts. Trayvon's mother, Sabrina, identified the voice as her son's. While George's family claimed it was George's, forensic experts could not reach a consensus. Still, the haunting sound of those screams gripped the nation. By mid-March, the pressure forced Sanford Police Chief Bill Lee to step aside temporarily. Florida's Governor, Rick Scott, appointed Angela Corey as a special prosecutor to independently investigate the case. Finally, on April 11, 2012, after weeks of mounting tension, George was arrested and charged with second-degree murder. During the announcement, Angela stated solemnly that they had not come to that decision lightly and that they had based it on the facts and the law. George turned himself in to the authorities and appeared in court, looking pale and expressionless. His initial request for bond was denied, but later granted at $150,000. Media swarmed the courtroom, while protesters gathered outside with signs, wearing hoodies pulled tightly. Inside, attorneys began preparing for a trial that would become about far more than just the guilt or innocence of one man. Evidence remained contradictory. George's injuries seemed to support his claim of being attacked, while Trayvon's autopsy revealed signs of a struggle. The trial will revolve around the perspectives and decisions regarding whose plea for help in the 911 call is justified. George claimed he was in fear for his life, while prosecutors argued Trayvon had every reason to feel afraid first. As the trial approached, Sanford prepared for the weighty proceedings. The trial would not only focus on George or Trayvon, but also ignite debates about justice, race, self-defense laws, and the devastating consequences of fear and suspicion. The courtroom became a reflection of the nation, exposing truths many sought to deny and others could never escape. At its heart was an undeniable tragedy. A teenager lost his life. A man faced criminal charges, and the nation anxiously awaited the outcome. On June 10, 2013, nearly 18 months after Trayvon's death, State of Florida v. George began at the Seminole County Criminal Justice Center. The courtroom filled with reporters, legal experts, and the families of both Trayvon and George, all watching silently. George, dressed in a suit and tie, sat beside his attorneys, facing a charge of second-degree murder that carried the possibility of life in prison. While his eyes remained fixed forward, the eyes of the nation were squarely on him. Was George defending himself? Or was he the one who initiated a deadly confrontation that could have been avoided? The question was complex and had no simple answer. The prosecution, led by Assistant State Attorney Bernie de la Rionda, argued that George was mistaken in believing that a teenager walking through his neighborhood posed a threat, and then pursued, confronted, and killed him. De la Rionda told the jury that the case was not about race, but about right and wrong, emphasizing that George's actions were wrong. Prosecutors contended that George, armed with a gun, ignored a police dispatcher's suggestion to stop following Trayvon. This decision led to the confrontation that ended in Trayvon's death. To support their case, the prosecution brought forensic experts, audio specialists, and key witnesses to reconstruct the events of that night. The jury was played 911 recordings, with the screams in the background analyzed repeatedly in court. Both Trayvon's and George's families were asked to identify the voice. The prosecutor asked Sabrina, Trayvon's mother, who she recognized the voice to be, and she replied, her voice shaking, that it was Trayvon. In contrast, Gladys, George's mother, testified that the screams belonged to her son, stating that she knew it was George, as she had heard her son screaming for his life. The trial became an emotional clash of perspectives. Trayvon's friend, Rachel, who had been on the phone with him shortly before the shooting, testified about his fear and confusion. Her testimony was deeply personal but divisive. Defense attorneys questioned her credibility, while others criticized the racial and cultural biases shaping the public's perception of her. The defense, led by Mark O'Mara, portrayed George as a man attacked by Trayvon, pinned to the ground, and beaten. They presented photos of George's bloodied nose and head injuries and called witnesses to corroborate his account. John Good, a neighbor, testified that he had seen someone in a dark hoodie on top of another person during the struggle, which matched Trayvon as the aggressor. John said that the person on the bottom had been the one yelling for help. George did not testify, following his attorney's advice. Instead, the defense relied on George's recorded statements to the police, which were played for the jury. In these interviews, George described Trayvon as the aggressor and claimed he acted in self-defense. He alleged that Trayvon had followed him, punched him, and slammed his head into the sidewalk. He stated that he had been screaming for help and had thought he was going to die. The defense aimed to establish enough reasonable doubt to show that George's actions stemmed not from malice, but from fear. Under Florida's self-defense and stand your ground laws, that fear justified acquittal. The courtroom atmosphere was tense throughout the trial, with emotional reactions from both families, jurors, an all-female group of 6, 5 of whom were white, carefully took notes and observed testimony. In their closing arguments, the prosecution urged the jury to rely on common sense, asserting that George had made a false preconception about Trayvon. De La Rionda argued that George had considered Trayvon a suspect from the start, when in fact he had every right to be there. The defense, in contrast, focused on the physical evidence and George's feelings of fear. Mark declared that there were no monsters in this matter and insisted that the only fair verdict was to declare George innocent. After more than 16 hours of deliberation over 2 days, a verdict was reached. On July 13, 2013, just after 10:00 p.m., George was found not guilty. Silence filled the courtroom. George showed little reaction as his family quietly embraced. Trayvon's parents were not present, choosing to avoid the emotional weight of the moment. News outlets announced the verdict to the nation, their tone measured but solemn. Almost immediately, demonstrations erupted across the country, some peaceful, others filled with anger and grief, all stemming from deep pain. The jury later admitted that reaching a decision had been difficult. One juror, known only as B37, shared in an interview that they had all wanted to find George guilty of something, but the law had given them nothing to convict him of. Another anonymous juror explained that George's fear for his life in that moment aligned with the case the defense presented and the legal standards they had to apply. The law ultimately determined the outcome of this case, but for many, it didn't feel like true justice. Nonetheless, The law had the final say. George was acquitted. Legally, the matter was closed. But the story, with all its pain, division, and reckoning, was far from over. George Zimmerman was found legally innocent and set free. But his real life was not the same. The world he re-entered had fundamentally shifted, and so had he. Overnight, he became a polarizing figure celebrated by some and condemned by many. In the years following his acquittal, George remained a controversial figure, frequently making headlines, not for his freedom, but for a series of troubles. He was involved in road rage incidents, domestic disputes, and public altercations. He sued media outlets and political figures, and even auctioned off the gun used in Trayvon's death. For George, freedom did not bring peace. Trayvon Martin, however, never got another chance. He remained forever 17, preserved in the final photo shared by his parents, his face youthful and his hoodie pulled over his head. Yet, his name became far bigger than his life. It resonated in conversations, classrooms, protests, and policy debates. His death became a symbol, not only for justice but for systemic reform. Trayvon's parents, Sabrina Fulton and Tracy Martin, transformed their grief into activism. They founded the Trayvon Martin Foundation to combat gun violence and support families impacted by it. Though their pain never subsided, they carried it with grace and turned it into purpose, demonstrating how dignity could exist in the face of profound loss. The trial's impact rippled across the United States. Trayvon's hoodie became a symbol of defiance. His tragic story sparked urgent dialogue about race, profiling, and perception. For many, his death marked a turning point, a moment when either something broke or something awakened. This loss fueled a movement, giving rise to a rallying cry, Black Lives Matter. Sanford, Florida, once an unremarkable city, became a focal point of America's ongoing struggle with race and justice. The police force underwent changes in leadership, and community initiatives intensified. Yet, the weight of those events never truly lifted. That night and its aftermath left a lasting impression not only on Sanford, but on the entire nation. Years later, the same questions lingered. What if George had stayed in his car? What if someone had stepped in earlier? What if Trayvon Martin had survived? There are no definitive answers, only pain, and the harsh reality that, in that rain, the encounter between an armed man and a black teenager forever changed the way America saw itself. Jeffrey Marsalis, born in the 1970s and raised in Idaho, grew up in a state better known for its scenic mountains and ski resorts than national scandals. While not especially prominent, the Marsalis family was well regarded in the local community, appearing to be an average, stable, upper-middle-class household, quiet, tidy, and seemingly ordinary. From a young age, Jeffrey was seen as intelligent, composed, and self-assured. Teachers described him as clever, sometimes too clever, with a keen sense of observation that could inspire either admiration or suspicion. He wasn't outspoken, but he thrived on being persuasive, often taking on the role of a subtle performer. As a teenager, Jeffrey was athletic, clean-cut, and active in school organizations. He avoided trouble, maintained a clean criminal record, and always presented himself as polite to adults. His outward appearance and demeanor painted a picture of an ambitious young man, underestimated by some but clearly driven. After high school, Jeffrey pursued higher education and enrolled in nursing school. He chose a career in healthcare, a field grounded in trust and compassion, traits he effectively portrayed. He never completed an advanced degree, though his partial education helped him speak confidently about healthcare, impressing those less familiar with the field. In the early 2000s, Jeffrey moved to Philadelphia, a city full of educational institutions and professional opportunities. He rented a small apartment and began presenting himself as Dr. Jeff, weaving lies and truths together so seamlessly it was hard for others to discern reality. He constructed elaborate personas, portraying himself as a doctor, Navy officer, CIA agent, trauma surgeon, and even astronaut, tailoring his identity to suit his audience. His act was convincing, complete with props like stethoscopes, military gear, badges, NASA memorabilia, and forged documents, all reinforcing his false narratives. Jeffrey used online dating platforms like Match.com to extend his web of deception. His polished profile, featuring sharp photos and a veneer of sophistication, appealed to women seeking a successful, educated, and committed partner. He played the role flawlessly, presenting himself as the ideal match. To acquaintances, Jeffrey was a charismatic enigma. He could engage in discussions on a broad range of topics, from foreign policy to anatomy, military strategy, or romance, adjusting his charm based on his audience. He didn't come across as threatening, but rather as polished and intriguing. While he kept a low profile in public, he thrived in one-on-one interactions, where he dominated conversations and carefully controlled the narrative. Romantically, he had little trouble attracting partners. He claimed to be a doctor working at 3 of Philadelphia's top hospitals, a veteran of classified overseas missions, and a high-level intelligence operative with powerful connections in Washington. Although his stories were extravagant, his calm confidence often made people believe him. When questioned, he always had convincing explanations. Jeffrey told women he was restricted from sharing certain details due to national security concerns. His apartment featured just enough theatrics to make his stories believable: a fingerprint scanner on his computer, a CIA-themed screensaver, and files marked with terms like top secret or eyes only. To those meeting him for the first time, the combination of real-world elements and fantasy seemed plausible. However, beneath the facade, there were inconsistencies. He frequently changed jobs, showed little commitment to any single profession, and never finished his advanced education. His work history was inconsistent, but it didn't immediately raise suspicion. Jeffrey moved fluidly between social circles, blending in well enough to avoid scrutiny while standing out just enough to capture attention. When people met Jeffrey casually, they rarely noticed any discrepancies in his character. He appeared confident, successful, and composed, someone worth knowing. Women who went on dates with him often left impressed, feeling special and chosen. Jeffrey had a knack for quickly understanding people, figuring out what they wanted to hear, and delivering it. It wasn't just simple charm. It was a calculated strategy. Yet, behind his polished image, Jeffrey had no close friends and confided in no one. He was constantly on the move, reshaping his identity to fit the moment. Whether in Philadelphia or Idaho, the story was always the same: Dr. Jeff, a man with purpose, connections, and nothing that seemed worth questioning. But the truth was starkly different. Jeffrey was none of the things he claimed to be. He had no medical license, no military experience, and no credentials to support the image he meticulously curated. For years, no one saw through his act. He walked through life projecting the appearance of someone with it all together. Jeffrey controlled the narrative about himself. When women met him online, typically through Match.com, they believed him. He was polished, articulate and educated and low-key charming in a way that inspired trust. He didn't appear arrogant or controlling. On the contrary, he seemed caring, empathetic, and safe. But things were not as they seemed, and troubling patterns began to surface. Women who interacted with Jeffrey shared eerily similar stories. At first, he would send thoughtful messages and smoothly suggest meeting for drinks. Their first date often involved alcohol, wine, cocktails, or beer. He'd make engaging conversation, ask questions, and come across as a busy man truly invested in getting to know them. Each woman left feeling special, as though they'd been given a glimpse into his exciting, secretive life. The evening often ended with an invitation to his place or for just one more drink. Then everything went silent. All emotions stopped. Time passed, leaving behind an uneasy feeling. Many women reported waking up in an unfamiliar bed, naked, disoriented, and physically unwell. Sometimes Jeffrey was beside them. Other times, they were alone. Their clothing would be misarranged, their bodies would ache, and they'd have no memory of consenting, or even of what had happened. When they confronted him, he denied anything unusual. He would feign surprise or dismiss their concerns, saying that they had had too much to drink or that they had really been into it, and told them not to make it a big deal. Many people felt self-conscious, began to doubt themselves, tried to explain the situation, and hesitated to call the police. After all, Jeffrey was known as Dr. Jeff, a Navy veteran and trauma specialist. Who would believe otherwise about him? That all changed in 2005 when a young woman from Idaho, known as Jody, decided to speak up. Jody met Jeffrey while working at the Sun Valley Resort in Idaho, where he had relocated after initial allegations began to emerge in Philadelphia. At the resort, he worked as a security guard, not a doctor, but his lies continued. He claimed to be involved in military intelligence and hinted at a life filled with experiences most people couldn't imagine. Jody has no romantic interest in Jeffrey because she is openly gay. However, she accepts his invitation to have a drink as a friend because she believes she can trust him. That night, something went horribly wrong. After Jody left her beer unattended and later drank from it, she suddenly felt dizzy and disoriented. She tried to leave, but Jeffrey insisted on walking her home. She eventually passed out. The next morning, she woke up naked in an unfamiliar room, vomiting and feeling physically violated. Her memories were fragmented, but her instincts told her something terrible had happened. Meanwhile, Jeffrey acted as though nothing was wrong, calling her his little gay buddy and walking her back to her dorm. But Jody refused to ignore her intuition. She went to the hospital, contacted the police, and submitted to an abuse kit exam immediately. Unlike the women in Philadelphia, Jody had physical evidence, DNA and medical documentation that confirmed her story. Meanwhile, in Philadelphia, the Special Victims Unit had already begun piecing together complaints against Jeffrey. Quiet investigations had started after one woman came forward months earlier. The more investigators dug, the more names emerged. Women from Match.com, as well as those he met socially, began to recount similar experiences. Over time, 21 women stepped forward, each with chillingly consistent accounts of how Jeffrey had deceived and harmed them. Detective Charlie Conway recalled the moment the pattern became evident. He said that those weren't isolated misunderstandings and that it was a clear and deliberate scheme. Evidence mounted when investigators found a spreadsheet on Jeffrey's computer titled Yearly Calendar of Women. It listed names, dates, places, and cryptic notes. A chilling record prosecutors believed documented his victims. In his Philadelphia apartment, Police uncovered disturbing items: a bulletproof vest, a police baton, fake hospital IDs, medical equipment, and forged or stolen military and government documents, including Navy insignias and fake CIA credentials. Among his belongings were a fingerprint scanner and software imitating a classified government system. A framed NASA astronaut photo added to the collection of identities Jeffrey used to deceive. Victims' stories followed a similar pattern. They described going on dates that ended in blackouts, waking up with no memory of what happened. Many felt trapped in shame, confusion, and disorientation. Shockingly, some continued seeing him, caught in cycles of manipulation and trauma. Jeffrey used not just drugs, but psychological control, breaking down their ability to consent. Prosecutors have faced significant challenges. Many victims come forward months or even years after the attack, leaving behind little physical evidence, such as banned substance test results, abuse kits, or witnesses. Cases often rely heavily on victim testimony. While this testimony is reliable, it is often insufficient to meet the high standard of proof in criminal cases. The case took a turn in 2006. Jeffrey was arrested in Sun Valley, Idaho, after a woman named Jody reported him immediately. Her swift action, coupled with medical evidence from an abuse kit and visible injuries, strengthened the case against him. Authorities in Idaho collaborated with Philadelphia investigators, who were building their own case based on a pattern of accusations. When confronted, Jeffrey remained calm, denying all allegations. His defense attempted to cast him as a harmless ladies' man who was being targeted by regretful women. Prosecutors, however, focused on exposing his systematic deceit. In addition to charges of abuse and assault, Jeffrey also faced allegations of impersonating public officials, committing identity fraud, and obstructing justice. By masquerading as a doctor, soldier, or spy, he not only lured victims, but also used these personas to dominate and silence them. Meanwhile, victims began connecting with one another, forming a support network to share stories and timelines. Many said it was the first time they felt heard and validated. As Jeffrey awaited trial, the scale of his crimes became clearer. Over the years, he had meticulously planned his actions, refining his methods and keeping detailed records to avoid detection. Each victim thought she was alone, unaware of the full scope of his predation. By spring 2007, Jeffrey stood trial in a Philadelphia courtroom in one of the city's most disturbing serial abuse cases. Once regarded as a charismatic and educated professional, he is now facing charges, including abuse, from 7 separate victims. Despite this, the case posed challenges. Prosecutors had no physical evidence from the Philadelphia victims, no toxicology reports, no abuse kits, and no witnesses. What they did have were consistent, compelling testimonies from women who had never met each other, but shared the same harrowing stories. They described Jeffrey's charm, his offers of drinks, the unexplained blackouts, and waking up confused, violated, and ashamed. Assistant District Attorney Joe McGettigan built the case around this consistency. Along with the damning spreadsheet found on Jeffrey's laptop, the yearly calendar of women provided names, dates, and chilling notes that painted a picture of systematic abuse. Prosecutors also introduced evidence of Jeffrey's fake identities, including a CIA badge, hospital IDs, and military props, used to manipulate and exploit his victims. One by one, the women testified. Many wept. Others trembled as they recounted their trauma. They spoke about sickness, helplessness, self-blame, and waking up disoriented with their clothes in disarray. Some admitted staying in touch with him afterward, explaining how psychological manipulation left them unable to confront their abuse. This emotional confusion became a focal point of the defense's argument. Defense attorney James Funt argued that all the encounters were consensual, claiming the accusers felt regret, not trauma. He highlighted the absence of timely police reports and pointed out inconsistencies in their recollections. The defense also noted the lack of medical evidence, arguing that in a case based solely on memories, doubt was unavoidable. Jeffrey sat silently in the courtroom, rarely showing emotion and occasionally smiling. He portrayed himself as a victim of a vendetta, targeted for his persona rather than his actions. His defense team insisted he never claimed to be a CIA agent or a doctor, arguing these were misunderstandings or exaggerations created by the women themselves. In March 2007, the verdict was announced. Jeffrey was acquitted of all charges except 2, for which he was found guilty of abuse. His acquittal on the most serious charges shocked many, particularly the women who had risked everything to testify. While the partial conviction was a legal victory, it felt emotionally hollow. Jeffrey was released on bail. However, his legal troubles were far from over. In Idaho, Jeffrey faced a separate, much stronger case, built on physical evidence. In 2009, he was tried in Blaine County for the abuse of Jody, a 21-year-old woman who had immediately sought medical help and cooperated fully with law enforcement. This time, the prosecution had what was missing in Philadelphia: an abuse kit, DNA evidence, documented injuries, and a clear timeline. They presented expert witnesses and highlighted the consistency between Jody's account and stories told by women from the previous case. Jeffrey's history, detailed in his spreadsheet and patterns of behavior, was laid bare. Jody testified with precision, recounting the night she drank with Jeffrey, how she detected something granular in her beer, the disorientation that followed, and the terror of waking up naked beside him. Her testimony was clear, her fear undeniable. The defense once again argued that the encounter was consensual and claimed Jody had misinterpreted the situation. But the jury rejected their narrative. In 2009, Jeffrey was convicted of abuse in Idaho and sentenced to life in prison. For the first time, the justice system handed down a punishment that matched the severity of Jeffrey's crimes. Crimes many believed he had been committing for years. The courtroom in Idaho resounded with relief, a stark contrast to the frustration felt in Philadelphia 2 years earlier. Jeffrey's carefully constructed double life had crumbled. The man who once boasted about being a doctor, Navy SEAL, CIA operative, and even an astronaut, was now just another inmate. For the women who testified against him, the legal outcomes brought both vindication and lingering pain. In Philadelphia, his acquittal on the most serious charges devastated many. 21 women shared their stories, but their voices were not reflected in the final verdict. In Idaho, however, the guilty verdict and life sentence represented a long-awaited moment of accountability. For Jody, the survivor whose immediate actions and forensic evidence proved pivotal, it was more than a legal triumph, it was deeply personal. Her courage to speak out promptly and consistently made all the difference. Her case demonstrated what is possible when survivors are believed, supported, and protected by the justice system. The Jeffrey case stands as a chilling example of how image, privilege, and manipulation can allow someone to avoid accountability for years. He had no criminal record, dressed impeccably, and spoke with professionalism and authority. In a justice system often plagued by doubt and contradiction, these traits worked in his favor until they didn't. The case also reignited debates on how the legal system deals with dating abuse, especially when physical evidence is lacking. Prosecutors and victims' advocates highlighted the narrow definitions of proof and the challenges of pursuing cases where the weapon isn't a knife, but a drink. In court, women not only had to explain what happened to them, but were also scrutinized for how they reacted, how quickly they reported the crime, and whether their accounts were perfect enough to be believed. The case of Jeffrey Marsalis serves as a warning about the illusion of safety, how someone can be well-dressed, well-spoken, and still pose a threat. It underscores the cost of silence and the immense bravery required to come forward. Above all, it reminds us that predators don't always appear monstrous. Sometimes, they look like the man you met online, the one with the warm smile, whose story seemed just believable enough. Jeffrey's deception was widespread, but in the end, it wasn't enough to protect him. Shirley Seitz grew up in northern Alabama, a region known for its small churches lining the roads and the sounds of gospel music filling Sunday mornings. She was raised in a working-class, faith-driven family that valued giving over taking and encouraged living life with purpose, kindness, and passion for music. From an early age, Shirley was captivated by music and ministry. Those who knew her spoke of her as a warm, charismatic woman whose voice could inspire and comfort everyone who heard it. Her favorite hymn, Amazing Grace, was more than a song to her. It was how she approached life. She embodied the qualities of an evangelist, someone who didn't just preach the word, but lived it, demonstrating compassion and service daily. Shirley not only kept her faith, but also actively participated in pastoral activities. She traveled to churches and gatherings across the region, not as a celebrity or famous singer, but as someone who connected sincerely with others. Her storytelling brought scripture to life, and her presence in the room was unforgettable. However, Shirley's life wasn't without challenges. Despite her deep faith, she experienced difficulties, particularly in her relationships. She had been married several times, enduring the heartbreak of failed relationships that ended in disappointment or disillusionment. Nonetheless, she remained hopeful and never stopped believing in love. Her family admired her perseverance in always seeing the good in people, even when others did not see it. By the time Shirley met Michael Vollschlager, she was in her 50s. Her children were grown, and she had recently inherited a significant sum following the death of her previous husband, providing her with financial stability for the first time. While she wasn't looking for a fairy tale romance, she sought a partnership built on trust, respect, and shared faith. Michael entered her life with charm and confidence. A chiropractor by profession, he had practiced in Florida and claimed to have helped many through his work. Known as Dr. Mike, he projected an image of purpose and refinement that resonated with Shirley's values. He shared stories of past struggles and emphasized his Christian beliefs. To Shirley, who had always seen herself as a healer, Michael seemed like someone deserving of redemption, and she wanted to give him that chance. In the early days of their relationship, Shirley appeared happy. She and Michael married after just 3 months of courtship. However, her family, particularly her daughter and brothers, expressed concerns about the rapid pace of the relationship and Michael's financial instability, failed past relationships, and lack of a steady job. Despite their reservations, Shirley asked them to trust her judgment. After their marriage, Shirley and Michael moved into a small house in Loxley, South Alabama, on a street with the charming name Camelot. For Shirley, the name symbolized hope for a lifetime of happiness. She sought to create a peaceful life filled with prayer, music, and visits from loved ones. Shirley supported Michael financially in the beginning, covering expenses for their home, furniture, and vehicle, viewing these as acts of love rather than burdens. Despite their initial concerns, Shirley's family tried to welcome Michael. They joined the couple for meals, family celebrations, and holidays. Shirley's mother Myrtle, her daughter Sharon, and her brother Ricky stayed closely connected through frequent visits and calls. Shirley had always been the emotional anchor of the family, making each member feel valued and appreciated. Her family treasured this closeness and wanted to preserve it. Even after she remarried, Shirley was a steadfast presence in her community, continuing to lead worship services and provide spiritual guidance to those who turned to her. She was rarely seen in public without a smile, staying true to the principles that had always defined her: honesty, humility, and forgiveness. Her conversations with family were often filled with scripture and warm words of encouragement. Even during difficult moments or when she felt overwhelmed, she worked hard to shield those around her from her struggles. However, over time, the family began to notice small but noticeable changes in Shirley. Her voice, once strong and self-assured, began to waver. Her energy seemed drained, and she spoke differently about her life at home. Although she never directly criticized her husband, small comments hinted at financial pressures or emotional fatigue. True to her nature, Shirley kept most of her worries to herself, not wanting to burden others. To her family, she still seemed like a woman determined to make her relationship work. A woman holding on to faith in love, despite having gone through 4 previous marriages. She still gives her time, resources, faith, and trust to others. Yet, none of them could have foreseen the storm ahead. Even as doubt began to creep into their minds, they had no way of imagining the tragedy that would soon unfold. On the surface, Shirley and Michael appear to be an ordinary couple, living peacefully in a small town in Alabama. However, behind the closed doors, tensions were escalating, slowly at first. Then, with alarming intensity, Shirley's family began feeling uneasy after her marriage to Michael. Their concerns weren't based on mere suspicion, but on clear changes they observed. Shirley, once vibrant with joy and spiritual energy, seemed to be retreating from her old self. Her phone calls became less frequent. She stopped visiting her family as frequently, and her daughter Sharon noticed how she avoided questions about Michael and their finances. Unbeknownst to her family, Shirley had been almost entirely supporting Michael. He had no steady job or reliable source of income, yet his financial demands continued to grow. Shirley used the life insurance money from her late husband to sustain their life together, paying for their home, buying him a truck, and helping him with overdue bills. What began as generosity on Shirley's part eventually turned into an expectation, and finally, an obligation. As the financial strain increased, emotional distance followed. Michael began pressuring Shirley for more money, and while she initially resisted quietly, her unease began to show. In conversations with her daughter and mother, she cautiously shared her concerns. In a phone call, she mentioned that Michael was very upset when she brought up the bills. However, her reluctance to elaborate left her family unaware of the full extent of the trouble. The last time Shirley was seen alive was March 21, 2010. That night, during their conversation, she told her daughter Sharon that she loved her, without any urgency. The following day, she stopped answering her phone, which was unlike her. Sharon grew anxious. Her mother never went silent without reason. When Ricky, Shirley's brother, went to her house to check on her, Michael met him outside, calm and composed. Michael claimed Shirley had left with a friend for a spiritual retreat, but something felt wrong. The house was unnervingly quiet. Shirley's purse and phone were inside. Her car was still in the driveway, and Michael, while outwardly calm, showed no genuine concern. Alarmed, the family reported Shirley missing within hours. The Loxley Police Department launched an investigation. Officers searched the house, the nearby woods, and pressed Michael for answers. His story quickly unraveled. Initially, he said Shirley had gone out alone. Later, he claimed she had left with someone from church, but he couldn't name anyone or explain why her belongings had been left behind. The inconsistencies raised suspicion, and investigators began digging into Michael's background. What they uncovered painted a disturbing picture. Michael had a history of deception and exploitation. Court records revealed a string of failed relationships, financial troubles, and manipulative behavior. His past wives had accused him of fraud, emotional abuse, and even making threats. Shirley seemed to have fallen for his charm, only to end up as the latest victim in a disturbing pattern. As the investigation escalated, police used cadaver dogs to search the property. On March 24th, 3 days after Shirley vanished, the dogs led officers to a shallow grave behind her and Michael's home. Upon digging, investigators unearthed a tarp. Beneath it, wrapped tightly in layers of plastic, lay the body of Shirley. Her face had been covered in duct tape, and her body showed signs of restraint. The autopsy concluded that her death was caused by asphyxiation. This was no accident. It was intentional. The crime scene revealed a chilling story. Shirley's disappearance wasn't straightforward. She was murdered in her own home, likely on the night she last spoke with her daughter. Her body was buried just feet from the house where she had once sung gospel hymns and prayed for peace. Michael was arrested immediately. During his initial interview, he denied any involvement. He claimed ignorance, suggested someone else was responsible, and argued he was being framed. However, the evidence told a different story. Investigators uncovered signs of a struggle inside the home. Blood found in the bedroom and hallway matched Shirley's. The duct tape discovered on her face was identical to a roll found in the garage. Cell phone records placed Michael near the burial site in the early morning hours following her disappearance. Further investigation revealed a motive. Shirley had recently confronted Michael about financial issues. She had begun to assert herself, talking about cutting off money and needing space. Michael, fearing the loss of his home, truck, and financial security, snapped. Police believed greed drove him. He had grown accustomed to the comforts Shirley's generosity provided. When she started resisting, he saw no way forward except to eliminate her. The arrest left the small town in shock. Neighbors who once exchanged pleasantries with Michael now spoke to reporters. Church friends wept. Shirley, a woman known for her kindness and service, had been killed by the very man she tried to love and support. In the aftermath, more of Shirley's loved ones came forward. Some recalled seeing unexplained bruises she dismissed. Others mentioned that they had heard her say she didn't want to fight anymore, but had assumed she was referring to verbal arguments. No one had imagined it would escalate to that. The district attorney acted swiftly, assembling a case that painted Michael as calculating and manipulative. They gathered digital evidence, financial records, and statements from his former spouses. A disturbing pattern emerged: a man who used charm, faith, and emotional neediness to exploit vulnerable women, draining them financially and emotionally. In Shirley's case, the outcome was deadly. Michael's trial began in Baldwin County, Alabama, gripping the small community with disbelief and anger. Once seen smiling in family photos with Shirley, Michael now stood accused of first-degree murder. Prosecutors focused their strategy on proving intent, motive, and premeditation. Every detail, they argued, demonstrated that the crime was deliberate. The timeline was critical. Prosecutors outlined how Shirley was last heard from on March 21, 2010. Her car, purse, and phone were left behind. Michael's accounts of her disappearance were riddled with inconsistencies. Detectives testified about the grave, describing it as hastily dug and shallow but deliberately hidden under a blue tarp and littered with debris. Medical experts confirmed Shirley's death resulted from asphyxiation, likely due to the duct tape wrapped around her face. Gruesome crime scene photos were shown in court, depicting Shirley's bound and wrapped body buried close to her home. The images were unbearable for her family, with some leaving the courtroom, while others silently leaned on one another for support. Financial records presented by the prosecution revealed that Shirley had been funding Michael's lifestyle, covering expenses like the mortgage and his truck. Her daughter Sharon and brother Ricky testified that Shirley had grown increasingly frustrated in the weeks before her death. She had started setting boundaries, saying no more often, and shared that she was contemplating changes in her life. Prosecutors argued that these actions triggered Michael's fear of losing his financial support, leading him to commit murder out of desperation. This case struck the core of the close-knit community, as neighbors mourned the loss of Shirley, generous, loving, and undeserving of what happened. Michael's defense team presented an alternative perspective. While they didn't dispute that Shirley was dead or that her body was discovered on Michael's property, they argued that her death wasn't premeditated. They claimed the tragedy resulted from an argument that spiraled out of control, causing Michael to act out of panic rather than calculated intent. They sought to depict him as an emotionally distraught man, overwhelmed and desperate, rather than a deliberate murderer. However, the jury also heard testimony from Michael's former spouses, which painted a vastly different and more disturbing picture. Two women described a history of manipulation in Michael's past relationships, including financial control, emotional abuse, and subtle threats. While the court carefully limited the scope of these testimonies, they underscored a consistent narrative. Michael appeared outwardly charming, but behaved very differently in private. Michael chose not to testify in his defense, leaving his legal team to rely solely on cross-examination and closing arguments to raise doubt. Ultimately, the evidence was overwhelming, the inconsistencies impossible to ignore, and the tragedy undeniable. After only a few hours of deliberation, the jury delivered its decision. Michael Wollschläger was found guilty of first-degree murder. He was sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. For Shirley's family, the verdict brought some measure of justice, but no peace. No ruling could reverse the events or bring Shirley back. The courtroom offered something the family had sought since her disappearance: certainty. In that moment, they knew what had happened, even if it couldn't undo their loss. In Loxley, Alabama, a quiet, close-knit community, life eventually returned to its regular pace. Yet Shirley's absence left a void that could never be filled. Her death cast a long shadow over the town she had once served so faithfully. Her voice, once a source of praise and worship, lived on only in the memories of those who loved her. Shirley's family bore a layered grief. There was the pain of losing a mother, younger sister, and daughter. But there was also the agony of hindsight. They had felt uneasy about her quick marriage to Michael, worried about her silences, and ignored instincts that something was wrong. Despite all this, Shirley had never asked for help, a fact that haunted them deeply. She had always been the one others leaned on for support, for strength, and when she needed help herself, she chose to carry the burden alone. Shirley's daughter, Sharon, who used to call her mother daily, later admitted that she wished she had tried harder to visit earlier, However, her mom always gave the impression that everything was fine, even when it wasn't. Sharon's words expressed a poignant pain shared by many families of victims, a mix of loss and helplessness. In the churches where Shirley once led congregations in song, vigils were held in her memory. Beneath her photograph, candles flickered as pastors spoke of forgiveness, strength, and justice. They also stressed vigilance, warning how evil can often disguise itself with charm and kindness. Michael Wollschläger would spend the rest of his life behind bars, with no chance of parole or appeals to undo his actions. While legal justice was served, the deeper wound, the loss of Shirley and all she brought to the world, remained unhealed. Shirley lived her life rooted in faith, believing in redemption, second chances, and the goodness of others. Ironically, it was this unwavering trust that cost her everything. But it also defined her legacy. For those who loved her, it was this light, her faith, resilience, and quiet strength that they carried forward. Imagine living in a place where everyone knows your name, where Friday night football games bring the whole town together, and the biggest worry is whether Mrs. Henderson's apple pie will win first place at the county fair again. A place where kids ride their bikes until the streetlights come on, and parents never think twice about letting them walk to school alone. This was Acme, Washington, in 1989. A tiny logging community nestled in the shadow of the North Cascade Mountains, where trust wasn't just expected, it was a way of life. The kind of place where folks still left their doors unlocked and helped their neighbors without being asked. But sometimes, the most peaceful places harbor the darkest secrets. And sometimes, evil finds its way into paradise. On a crisp November morning in 1989, that peace would be shattered forever. A young woman's life would be stolen, a family would be destroyed, and an entire community would discover that safety is just an illusion. This is the story of Mandy Stavik, and the case that haunted a small town for nearly 3 decades. 18-year-old Amanda Stavik was everything you'd want in a daughter. Bright, athletic, ambitious, the kind of girl who lit up every room she entered. She'd been the star of her high school basketball team, a cheerleader, and one of the top students in her graduating class. Everyone called her Mandy, and everyone loved her. After graduating from Mount Baker High School, Mandy had headed off to Central Washington University with dreams of becoming a commercial airline pilot. It was an ambitious goal for a young woman in the late 80s, but those who knew Mandy weren't surprised. She'd always been determined to reach for the sky. Thanksgiving weekend 1989 found Mandy back home in Acme, taking a break from her freshman year of college. She was excited to spend time with her family, catch up with old friends, and enjoy the familiar comfort of the place she'd grown up. The day after Thanksgiving, November 24th, dawned clear and cold. It was the kind of crisp autumn day that made you want to get outside and breathe in the mountain air. For Mandy, who'd been a runner throughout high school, it was the perfect morning for a jog. She'd developed a routine during her years at Mount Baker High. Almost every day, she'd lace up her running shoes, clip a leash on her German Shepherd Kira, and head out onto the rural roads that wound through the countryside around Acme. It was her time to think, to clear her head, and to stay in the kind of shape that had made her such a formidable athlete. That Friday morning was no different. Mandy pulled on her running clothes, said goodbye to her family, and headed out with Kira by her side. She planned to follow her usual route, a path that would take her along Strand Road, past farmhouses and wooded areas, through the heart of the community she called home. It should have been just another run, but Mandy Stavik would never make it home. Hours passed, then more hours. As the afternoon wore on and evening approached, Mandy's family began to worry. She was responsible, reliable, not the type to disappear without explanation. When darkness fell and she still hadn't returned, they knew something was terribly wrong. The search began immediately. Friends, neighbors, family members, everyone who could help, fanned out across the rural roads and forest trails around Acme. They called her name until their voices were hoarse. They searched with flashlights long into the night. Kira, Mandy's faithful German shepherd, had returned home alone earlier that day. The dog was agitated, pacing nervously, as if trying to communicate something she couldn't express. But where was Mandy? For 3 agonizing days, the search continued. Volunteers scoured every inch of the countryside. Helicopters circled overhead. Boats searched the rivers and streams that cut through the landscape. The entire community came together, united in their desperate hope to bring Mandy home safely. But hope turned to horror on November 27th. Detective Ron Peterson was part of the search team that day. He'd been methodically working his way along the south fork of the Nooksack River in his Zodiac boat when something caught his eye. There, in a quiet side channel away from the main river, he spotted something pink floating in the dark water. It was Mandy. The discovery sent shockwaves through the tight-knit community. This wasn't supposed to happen in Acme. This wasn't supposed to happen anywhere, but especially not here, in their safe haven tucked away from the troubles of the wider world. As investigators began to piece together what had happened, a terrifying picture emerged. Mandy hadn't simply had an accident. She hadn't gotten lost or fallen into the river. Someone had deliberately taken her life. The evidence suggested that Mandy had been abducted while out on her run, likely by someone in a vehicle. She was too fast a runner to be caught on foot. Investigators reasoned her attacker had probably used a weapon to force her compliance, then taken her to a location several miles from her jogging route. What happened next was every parent's worst nightmare. Mandy had been sexually assaulted, but she hadn't given up without a fight. Scratches on her arms and legs suggested she'd tried to escape, running through blackberry bushes in a desperate attempt to get away from her attacker. In the end, her efforts weren't enough. Her killer had caught up with her, knocked her unconscious, and then placed her in the river to ensure she wouldn't survive. For Detective Peterson, who had children of his own, the case was deeply personal. As he recovered Mandy's body from the cold water, he whispered words that no parent should ever have to say. The memory of that moment would stay with him for the rest of his life. The investigation that followed was intense and thorough. Tips poured in from concerned citizens. Police interviewed dozens of potential suspects. They looked at everyone from local drifters to Mandy's own boyfriend, methodically working to rule out each possibility. One early person of interest was David Succi, a transient who'd been seen in the area on the day of Mandy's disappearance. But when investigators obtained his DNA, it didn't match evidence found at the crime scene. In fact, despite collecting DNA samples from 30 different men in the area, investigators came up empty. None of the samples matched. The case that had started with such promise, with physical evidence that should have led directly to the killer, suddenly hit a brick wall as months turned to years. The Mandy Stavik case began to go cold. The detective assigned to it would change. Files would be boxed up and stored away. The daily urgency that had driven the investigation would fade, but the impact on the community never did. In a place like Acme, everyone knew everyone. Mandy's murder didn't just take away a beloved daughter, sister, and friend. It stole something more fundamental, the sense of security that had defined life in this small town. Parents who had never worried about their children playing outside after dark suddenly found themselves checking locks twice before bed. Runners who had felt safe on the rural roads began looking over their shoulders. The easy trust that had been the foundation of community life was replaced by a nagging fear that the killer was still out there, still among them. Years passed, a decade, then another. The case remained officially open, but with each passing year, it seemed less likely that justice would ever be served. Mandy's family never stopped hoping, never stopped asking questions, but even they began to wonder if they would ever know the truth about what happened to their daughter. 25 years would pass before everything changed. 25 years before a casual conversation at a water park would crack the case wide open. 25 years before the people of Acme would finally learn that the monster they'd feared was someone they'd known all along. The breakthrough came from the most unlikely source imaginable. Two mothers, sitting on the grass at a local water park, watching their children splash down slides and play in the summer sun. They barely knew each other. These women, Heather Backstrom and Marilee Anderson, but they shared a connection that went back decades to their high school years at Mount Baker High. It was June 2013, and somehow the conversation turned to Mandy Stavik. Maybe it was the way the sunlight caught the water, or the sound of children laughing, that made them think of innocence lost, whatever prompted it. When Mandy's name came up, both women felt something stir inside them, a recognition, a shared suspicion they'd carried in silence for far too long. I just turned to Marilee and said, "Well, I'm sure I know who killed her," Heather would later recall. And she turned to me and said, "Oh, I do too." The name that came from both their lips was Timothy Bass. Tim Bass had been just another face in the halls of Mount Baker High School back in the late 80s. He wasn't particularly memorable, not a star athlete, not a troublemaker, not someone who stood out in any obvious way. He was just there, part of the background of small-town life. But for both Heather and Marilee, Tim Bass had been anything but forgettable. Each woman had experienced encounters with him that had left them deeply unsettled, encounters they'd never spoken about publicly, but had never been able to shake. For Heather, the memory went back to the summer of 1989, just months before Mandy's murder. She was 15 years old, sitting in a friend's truck after a softball game, when Tim Bass, then in his 20s, climbed in beside her. What started as casual conversation quickly turned uncomfortable. He began talking about her eyes, telling her how beautiful they were. Then he picked up a pen from the cup holder and began running it along her knees as she sat there in her cut-off sweatpants. She was just a teenager, trapped in a vehicle with an older man whose attention felt predatory and wrong. I was very nervous. She would remember years later. The incident had stayed with her, a moment of vulnerability and fear that she'd carried in silence. But Marilee's story was even more chilling. It was July 1991, nearly 2 years after Mandy's death. Marilee was at home alone with her young son when she heard a knock at her door. When she opened it, there stood Tim Bass, claiming he'd been hunting all day and needed to use her phone to call his wife. Something about his presence made her uncomfortable, but she let him in. When she handed him the phone, he dialed a number, but all they heard was the electronic beeping that indicated the call couldn't be completed. The number was disconnected or had never existed at all. Then, Tim's behavior became truly frightening. He walked through her kitchen toward her bedroom, making himself at home in her private space. He told her he used to drive by her house, that he'd always been in love with her, that he wanted to make love to her right then and there. Marilee was terrified. Here was a man who had inserted himself into her home under false pretenses. who was now making sexual advances while her child was nearby. She demanded that he leave, but he refused. Only when she threatened to call the police did he finally go. For more than 20 years, both women had carried these experiences alone, in a small town. Accusing someone of something you couldn't prove was dangerous. Reputations mattered. Families had to live together in the same community. Speaking up without absolute certainty felt impossible. But sitting there in that water park, watching their own children play, they realized they couldn't stay silent any longer. If their suspicions were right, if Tim Bass had killed Mandy Stavik, then their silence was protecting a murderer. They reached out to law enforcement, sharing their stories with Detective Ken Gates, another Mount Baker High graduate who understood the dynamics of their small community. The information was intriguing, but it wasn't evidence. After 24 years, police needed more than suspicions and uncomfortable memories. What they discovered when they began looking into Tim Bass was a man who had been hiding in plain sight all along. For the past quarter century, while Mandy's family grieved and the community lived in fear, Tim Bass had been living a quiet, seemingly normal life just miles from where the murder had taken place. He'd gotten married just 6 weeks after Mandy's death, settled down with his wife Gina, and had 3 children. He worked as a delivery driver for a local bakery, making his rounds through the very communities that had been searching for Mandy's killer. He had no significant criminal record. He kept to himself, went to work, came home. To all outward appearances, he was just another small-town family man living an unremarkable life. But the most shocking discovery was where he'd been living in 1989. Tim Bass's family home sat less than 2 miles from Mandy's house, right along one of her regular jogging routes. If he'd been looking out his window on any given day, he could have watched her run past. He could have learned her patterns, her timing, her routine. When police finally approached Bass in 2013, his behavior immediately raised red flags. Asked about Mandy Stavik, he pretended not to remember her at first. Mandy, he said, as if searching his memory. Oh yeah, she was a girl that they found in the river. Who could forget Mandy Stavik in a community the size of Acme? Her murder had been the defining tragedy of their generation. For someone who'd attended the same high school, lived in the same area, to claim he barely remembered her seemed absurd. When investigators asked Bass for a DNA sample, his refusal was immediate and telling. "I don't want to give my DNA," he said. "I watch those crime shows. I see how many people go to prison because they've given DNA." His refusal meant police had to get creative. They put Bass under surveillance, following him on his bakery delivery routes, hoping he would discard something that might contain his DNA. Night after night, they watched and waited. But Bass was careful. He threw nothing away that could be tested. The investigation might have stalled there, but Tim Bass had made one crucial mistake. He'd underestimated the people around him, particularly the women who worked alongside him every day. Kim Wagner was Bass's supervisor at the bakery, and she'd never quite felt comfortable around him. There was something off about the way he interacted with people, especially women. He never called her by name, instead referring to her simply as woman. The smallest things would set him off into angry outbursts, making co-workers wary of being around him. When investigators contacted the bakery and Kim realized they were investigating the Mandy Stavik murder, she put 2 and 2 together. They wanted DNA evidence from Tim Bass, and she was in a position to help them get it. For 3 months, Kim watched and waited, every day. She emptied the trash cans to make sure they were clean, hoping Tim would discard a cup or bottle that might contain his saliva. Every day, she watched him carefully, looking for her opportunity. Finally, it came. She saw him throw away a plastic cup, and later a Coke can. Her heart was racing as she retrieved the items, knowing that she might be handling evidence that could solve one of the most notorious crimes in the region's history. She hid the items in her desk drawer until she could turn them over to police. The wait for test results felt endless. But when Detective Kevin Bowie finally got the call from the state crime lab, the words he heard changed everything. "We've got a match." 28 years after Mandy Stavic's murder, police finally had their killer. The arrest of Timothy Bass on December 12, 2017, sent shockwaves through the community that had waited so long for answers. As Detective Bowie placed the handcuffs on the 50-year-old delivery driver in the bakery parking lot, the weight of nearly 3 decades seemed to lift from the shoulders of everyone who had never forgotten Mandy Stavic. But having a suspect and proving guilt in court are two very different things. Bass maintained his innocence, and his defense team was prepared to fight every piece of evidence the prosecution presented. When confronted with the DNA match, Bass's story began to evolve in ways that shocked even seasoned investigators. The man who had initially claimed he barely remembered Mandy suddenly had a very different tale to tell. He now insisted that he and Mandy had been having a secret affair, that their encounter had been consensual. It was a desperate gambit, one that required the jury to believe that an 18-year-old college freshman would have willingly engaged in a relationship with a man she'd never been seen with, never called, never mentioned to family or friends. The defense argued that DNA evidence only proved contact had occurred, not that a crime had been committed. But the prosecution had more than just DNA. They had a pattern of behavior that painted a disturbing picture of Timothy Bass. His own family members took the stand against him, describing a man who had shown disturbing attitudes toward women throughout his life. His ex-wife testified about years of controlling, abusive behavior. His brother revealed how Bass had asked him to lie to police, even suggesting they blame their deceased father for the crime. Perhaps most damning was the testimony from Kim Wagner, the brave woman who had helped police obtain the crucial DNA evidence. Her decision to act had been driven by a simple principle: doing what was right for Mandy. The trial lasted 9 days, but the jury's deliberation was mercifully brief. After just 5 hours, they returned with their verdict guilty on all counts of first-degree murder, first-degree rape, and first-degree kidnapping. 29 years and 6 months after Mandy Stavic was found floating in the Nooksack River, justice had finally been served. At his sentencing, Bass continued to proclaim his innocence, but Judge Evan Chaffee was unmoved. He sentenced Bass to nearly 27 years in prison, ensuring that the man who had stolen so much from so many would spend the rest of his meaningful life behind bars. For Mandy's family, the verdict brought a mixture of relief and continued grief. Her mother, Mary, who had spent decades wondering if she would ever see justice for her daughter, finally had her answer. Her sister, Molly, who had carried the pain of loss for so long, could finally begin to heal. But perhaps the most profound impact was felt by the community of Acme itself. The arrest and conviction of Timothy Bass didn't just solve a murder case, it gave back something that had been stolen from them nearly 30 years earlier. The fear that had shadowed their daily lives, the suspicion that had tainted their interactions, the loss of innocence that had changed their community forever. None of that could be completely undone, but they could finally stop looking over their shoulders. They could finally trust that the monster who had walked among them was where he belonged. The case of Mandy Stavic became more than just a murder investigation. It became a testament to the power of persistence, the importance of community, and the courage of ordinary people to do extraordinary things. From Detective Bowie, who never gave up on a case that others had written off, to Kim Wagner, who risked her own safety to help catch a killer, to the two mothers at a water park who finally found the courage to speak up. It took a village to bring Timothy Bass to justice. Today, Acme remains a small, close-knit community nestled in the shadow of the mountains. Children still play outside until the streetlights come on. Neighbors still help neighbors. And while the scars of November 1989 will never completely fade, the people of this town have reclaimed something precious, the knowledge that evil may find its way into paradise. But it cannot stay hidden forever. Mandy Stavik was just 18 years old when her life was cut short. But her legacy lives on in the justice that was finally served and in the community that never forgot her name. In the end, love proved stronger than fear, truth more powerful than lies, and justice, though delayed, would not be denied. This was the case no one could forget, and now, finally, no one has to. The morning sky churned with an ominous darkness that seemed to mirror the storm brewing in one woman's life. Crystal McDowell had no idea that August 25, 2017 would be the last day anyone would see her alive, as Hurricane Harvey barreled toward the Texas coast. Crystal made a decision that would change everything. She left her home that Friday morning, walking into what would become one of the most baffling disappearances in recent memory. This isn't just another missing person case. This is a story where nature's fury collided with human deception, where floodwaters would wash away evidence and complicate an investigation that already had more twists than anyone could imagine. By the time the storm passed, investigators would realize they weren't just fighting against time and weather. They were up against a killer who thought the perfect storm would be the perfect cover. What you're about to hear is the complete story of Crystal McDowell's disappearance, a case that would expose the dark secrets lurking beneath the surface of what appeared to be an ordinary life. 3 men would emerge as suspects. One would ultimately face justice, but the path to that courtroom would be anything but straightforward. Crystal McDowell was the kind of person who lit up every room she entered. Those who knew her described a woman with an infectious spirit, someone who knew exactly what she wanted from life and wasn't afraid to go after it. She had built a successful career as a flight attendant, traveling the world and embracing what friends called her gypsy soul. But by 2017, Crystal had traded the skies for real estate, diving headfirst into a new chapter of her professional life. At 43, Crystal was a mother to 2 children, 8-year-old Madden and 5-year-old Maui. She was also navigating the complexities of post-divorce life. Her marriage to Steve McDowell had officially ended just months earlier in June 2017 after 10 years together. What many described as an amicable split had left Crystal in an unusual living arrangement. She was staying in the master bedroom of the house she had helped Steve purchase, while he had moved upstairs to a different room. It was temporary, they said, just until Crystal's townhouse renovation was complete. But beneath this seemingly peaceful coexistence, there were undercurrents that few people fully understood. Crystal had recently begun dating Paul Hargrave, a local jewelry store owner. Their relationship was still new, just a few weeks old, but Crystal seemed genuinely happy. So happy, in fact, that she had posted on social media just days before her disappearance, declaring she had never been happier in her entire life. The timing of Crystal's vanishing couldn't have been worse. Hurricane Harvey was bearing down on the Texas Gulf Coast with unprecedented fury. Weather forecasters were predicting catastrophic flooding, and residents across the region were making final preparations for what would become one of the most devastating natural disasters in American history. Grocery store shelves had been stripped bare. Gas stations were running dry. Everyone who could leave had already evacuated. Crystal, however, had chosen to stay. She had responsibilities, people who depended on her. As a newly licensed real estate agent, she had clients to consider. As a mother, she had children to protect. The storm was supposed to last several days, and Crystal wanted to make sure her family was safe and prepared. That Friday morning started like any other. Crystal sent text messages to Paul, her new boyfriend. They exchanged their usual good morning pleasantries, making plans for when the storm passed. But as the hours ticked by, something changed. Paul replied to Crystal's messages, but she never responded back. At first, he assumed she was simply busy preparing for the hurricane. Everyone was scrambling to secure their homes and gather supplies, but Crystal's silence was completely out of character. She was the type of person who stayed in constant communication with the people she cared about. Her uncle Jeff, who had raised her after her parents died when she was just 11 years old, received messages from Crystal every single morning. She would check in throughout the day, sharing updates about her life, her work, her children. Jeff described his niece as one of the most responsible people he had ever known. Crystal never lost contact with her family. As Friday turned into Saturday, concern began to mount. The storm had arrived with a vengeance, dumping unprecedented amounts of rain across southeast Texas. Baytown, where Crystal lived, was taking a direct hit. Streets were flooding, power lines were down, and communication was becoming increasingly difficult. But even accounting for the chaos of the hurricane, Crystal's complete radio silence was alarming. Steve McDowell, Crystal's ex-husband, told family members that Crystal was supposed to have arrived at their house on Friday morning. He claimed she had sent him a text message at 7:01 that morning, saying she was on her way and asking if he had water. The message suggested she might stay with him and the children since it looked like the storm would be severe. But according to Steve, Crystal never showed up. Uncle Jeff became increasingly worried as Saturday stretched into Sunday with no word from Crystal. He began reaching out to relatives and friends, trying to piece together Crystal's last known movements. That's when he learned something that made his blood run cold. Multiple people told him the same thing, they just knew something wasn't right. Crystal would never disappear without explanation, especially not when her children needed her. The timing was catastrophic from an investigative standpoint. Hurricane Harvey was wreaking havoc across the entire region. Sheriff's deputies were dealing with their own flooded homes while simultaneously trying to coordinate rescue operations. Some investigators had lost everything they owned to the storm, yet they still showed up for work every single day, determined to find Crystal McDowell. District Attorney Cheryl Leak would later describe the challenges they faced. The flooding was so severe that normal investigative procedures became nearly impossible. Crime scene labs were underwater, evidence collection was compromised, transportation was limited. But despite these overwhelming obstacles, law enforcement remained committed to finding Crystal. They understood something that Crystal's family already knew. Mothers don't just disappear, especially not during natural disasters when their children need them most. As the floodwaters began to recede, investigators started to piece together a timeline of Crystal's final days. What they discovered painted a picture of a woman who was genuinely excited about her future. She had been making plans with Paul to travel to Europe. She had invited him to join her family on an upcoming cruise. Though there was one complication, her ex-husband Steve was also supposed to be on that cruise. This detail would prove to be more significant than anyone initially realized. Paul had expressed concern about the awkwardness of joining a family vacation that included Crystal's ex-husband. He had asked Crystal if Steve could perhaps skip the trip. According to Paul, Crystal had approached Steve about not attending the cruise, and Steve's reaction had been intense. He was visibly upset about being excluded from what he had apparently viewed as an opportunity to reconcile with Crystal. The investigation was further complicated by Crystal's extensive social circle. As a former flight attendant and current real estate agent, she knew people all across Texas and beyond. She was described as extremely social, someone who maintained friendships from every chapter of her life. This meant that investigators had dozens of potential witnesses to interview, relationships to explore, and alibis to verify. 3 men quickly emerged as persons of interest in Crystal's disappearance. There was Steve McDowell, the ex-husband who still shared a home with Crystal and seemed to harbor hopes of reconciliation. There was Paul Hargrave, the new boyfriend who had been one of the last people to see Crystal alive. And somewhat surprisingly, there was Uncle Jeff himself, whose emotional involvement in the case and tendency to interfere with the investigation had begun to raise questions among law enforcement. Each of these men had a different story about Crystal's final hours. Each claimed to want nothing more than to see her returned safely. But as investigators would soon discover, the truth was far more complicated than any of them were willing to admit. The discovery of Crystal's abandoned Mercedes in a motel parking lot would mark the beginning of the end of this tragic mystery. The discovery came from an unexpected source. While law enforcement was struggling against flooded roads and damaged communication systems, Crystal's own family and friends had organized their own search efforts. They knew the areas Crystal frequented, understood her habits and routines in ways that even the most dedicated investigators couldn't match. It was this intimate knowledge that led them to the breakthrough everyone had been hoping for. Crystal's black Mercedes was found sitting in the parking lot of a Motel 6, its doors unlocked, and keys resting conspicuously on the center console. Sheriff Hawthorne arrived at the scene and immediately knew something was wrong. In his years of law enforcement experience, he had never encountered an abandoned vehicle staged so obviously. Everything about the scene screamed setup. The car's placement seemed almost theatrical. It was positioned in plain sight, as if someone wanted it to be discovered. But whoever had left it there hadn't anticipated the massive flooding that Harvey would bring. The rising waters had trapped the Mercedes in the parking lot, making it impossible for anyone to drive it away. What had likely been planned as a temporary hiding spot had become a permanent crime scene. Processing the vehicle presented unique challenges. The flood damage had contaminated potential evidence, and the crime lab facilities in Houston were dealing with their own hurricane-related problems. Many of the technicians and analysts had lost their homes to the storm, yet they continued working around the clock to help solve this case. The dedication was remarkable, but the practical limitations were undeniable. Sheriff's deputies began canvassing nearby businesses, hoping to find security cameras that might have captured whoever had abandoned Crystal's car. The investigation was painstaking work made even more difficult by the storm's aftermath. Many businesses had suffered flood damage, and their surveillance systems were offline. But investigators persevered, checking every possible angle. Their persistence paid off when they discovered footage from a Shell gas station adjacent to the motel. The grainy video showed a figure emerging from what appeared to be Crystal's Mercedes and walking to a nearby trash receptacle. The person seemed to be disposing of something, pushing it deep into the container with deliberate force. Even more telling was the way this individual kept glancing toward the motel, as if checking to ensure the car was still where it had been left. The footage was far from perfect, but experienced investigators could make out enough details to identify the person as Steve McDowell. This was the first concrete evidence linking Crystal's ex-husband to her disappearance, and it fundamentally changed the direction of the investigation. Additional surveillance footage from the motel's own cameras showed someone parking Crystal's car and walking away. Again, the figure bore a strong resemblance to Steve McDowell. For investigators who had been working with limited physical evidence, these videos represented a major breakthrough. They finally had something concrete to work with. But Steve wasn't making things easy for law enforcement. When brought in for questioning, he maintained his story that Crystal had never arrived at his house that Friday morning. He insisted he had no idea what had happened to her and volunteered to help with the investigation in any way possible. His demeanor was cooperative, even friendly. But investigators noticed inconsistencies in his account. Polygraph tests were administered to both Steve and Paul Hargrave. The results were revealing. While Paul's test results were inconclusive, Steve failed his examination decisively. When confronted with these results, Steve's attorney advised him to stop cooperating with the investigation. The friendly, helpful ex-husband suddenly became evasive and defensive. Meanwhile, investigators were learning more about the dynamics of Crystal and Steve's relationship. What had been described as an amicable divorce was actually far more complicated. Family members revealed that Steve had never truly accepted the end of their marriage. He harbored fantasies about reconciliation and had been devastated when Crystal began dating someone else. Crystal's Aunt Cindy provided crucial insights into Steve's behavior. She described how he would cater to Crystal's every need, rubbing her feet when she was tired, brushing her hair when she asked. His devotion bordered on obsession, and Crystal's independence had been gradually eroding under the weight of his neediness. When Crystal finally decided to end their marriage, Steve's world had collapsed. The upcoming family cruise had taken on enormous significance in Steve's mind. He had apparently purchased matching white outfits for himself and Crystal, planning to propose to her during the trip. In his fantasy, they would remarry and start fresh. When Crystal uninvited him from the cruise to make room for her new boyfriend, it shattered his delusions about their future together. Financial pressures were also mounting in Steve's life. Crystal had been his primary source of financial support, and she had recently decided to cut him off. Friends described how Steve had been spending money recklessly, making purchases he couldn't afford, while Crystal covered his expenses. When she finally said she couldn't continue supporting his lifestyle, Steve faced the loss of not just his ex-wife, but his entire way of life. The investigation took another crucial turn when deputies discovered additional surveillance footage from a nearby Walmart. This video showed Steve purchasing a bicycle on the day Crystal disappeared. The timing was significant because it provided a potential explanation for how Steve had gotten home after abandoning Crystal's car at the motel. The bicycle purchase occurred after Crystal's Mercedes had been spotted at the motel, suggesting premeditation rather than a spontaneous act. Investigators were building a compelling circumstantial case, but they still lacked the direct evidence needed to make an arrest. Steve seemed to understand this, growing more confident and arrogant with each passing day. He would arrive at the sheriff's office for questioning and sit for hours, calmly denying any involvement in Crystal's disappearance. His attitude suggested he believed he was untouchable. The psychological pressure was mounting on all sides. District Attorney Cheryl Leek knew Steve was guilty, but struggled with the knowledge that knowing something and proving it in court were two very different challenges. The case was consuming enormous resources, and the community was demanding answers. Meanwhile, Steve retained custody of his and Crystal's two young children, a situation that made everyone uncomfortable. The breakthrough came when investigators realized they needed to apply different pressure to Steve. Rather than continuing to focus solely on gathering evidence, they decided to remove the children from his care. Working with Family Protective Services, they arranged for Madden and Maui to be placed with Crystal's Aunt Cindy. The psychological impact on Steve was immediate and devastating. Losing custody of the children represented Steve's final connection to his old life. Without Crystal, and without the kids, he had nothing left to lose. Investigators hoped this realization would finally break through his defenses and lead to a confession. They were betting everything on the theory that a man with nothing left to protect might finally tell the truth. The gamble was risky. If Steve decided to run or harm himself, they would lose their only real suspect and any chance of finding Crystal's body. But Sheriff Hawthorne made the difficult decision to allow Steve to go home one final time, giving him the night to consider his options. It was an unprecedented move that would either solve the case or let a killer escape justice forever. The night Steve spent at home would prove to be his last as a free man. Early the next morning, he called his daughter Krista, who was attending Texas A&M University, asking her to come home immediately. The urgency in his voice was unmistakable. When Krista arrived in the pre-dawn darkness, she found her father in a state she had never seen before. Steve was methodical that morning, almost businesslike as he handed over photo albums, financial documents, and even the keys to his prized Mustang to Krista. It seemed like her father was simply trying to get his affairs in order before facing whatever consequences awaited him. She had defended him throughout the investigation, believing completely in his innocence. But then the conversation took a chilling turn. Steve looked at his daughter and said something that would haunt her forever. He mentioned that investigators had told him they would reduce his punishment if he revealed where Crystal's body was located. When Krista protested that he couldn't possibly know such information, Steve's response was devastating. He looked away and broke down completely. In that moment, Krista realized the horrible truth. Her father knew exactly where Crystal McDowell was because he had put her there. The man she had defended, the father she had loved and trusted, was a killer. When police arrived to take Steve into custody, Krista collapsed to her knees and wept. At the sheriff's office, Steve finally began to talk. The confession came slowly, painfully, but it came nonetheless. He described how Crystal had returned home that Friday morning after spending the night with Paul. An argument had erupted immediately. Steve was furious that she had stayed out all night, devastated by her obvious happiness with another man. In his statement, Steve claimed that Crystal had become aggressive during their confrontation. He said she didn't love him anymore, that she had made that abundantly clear. But investigators believed the truth was simpler and more sinister. Steve McDowell had made a calculated decision. If he couldn't have Crystal, nobody could. The details Steve provided were horrific. He described strangling Crystal from behind, catching her completely off guard. She had no chance to defend herself, no opportunity to fight back. After killing the mother of his children, Steve had methodically disposed of her body, wrapping it in trash bags before driving to a remote wooded area. Steve led investigators to the location where he had dumped Crystal's remains. The site was densely wooded and difficult to access, chosen specifically because Steve believed it would never be discovered. Recovery efforts were complicated by the thick vegetation and the decomposition that had occurred during the weeks since Crystal's murder. When Crystal's body was finally recovered, the case officially became a homicide prosecution. Steve McDowell was arrested and charged with murder, ending months of speculation and bringing some measure of closure to Crystal's devastated family. The trial that followed would reveal the full extent of Steve's deception and obsession. Despite his confession, he attempted to claim that Crystal's death had been accidental, the result of what he described as a spontaneous embrace that had gotten out of control. The jury didn't believe him. After 5 days of testimony and evidence, it took the jury less than 4 hours to reach their verdict. Steve McDowell was found guilty of murder and sentenced to 50 years in prison. He will be eligible for parole in 2042 when he is in his 70s. The tragedy extended far beyond Crystal's death. 2 young children had lost both parents, their mother to murder, their father to prison. 8-year-old Madden and 5-year-old Maui would grow up knowing the devastating truth about how their family had been destroyed. Crystal McDowell's story serves as a stark reminder that domestic violence can lurk behind the facade of even the most seemingly normal relationships. Her death occurred during one of the most catastrophic natural disasters in American history. But the real storm had been brewing in her own home for years. Hurricane Harvey eventually passed, leaving behind billions of dollars in damage and forever changing the Texas Gulf Coast. But for Crystal's family and friends, the storm's most devastating casualty was a vibrant woman whose only crime was trying to build a new life for herself and her children. Today, Crystal's children are thriving under the care of family friends who have provided them with the stability and love they deserve. They carry their mother's memory with them, remembering her infectious spirit and her determination to always do what was right. This case stands as a testament to the dedication of law enforcement officers who refused to give up, even when facing seemingly impossible circumstances. Despite flooded crime labs, damaged evidence, and personal losses from the hurricane, they persevered until justice was served. Crystal McDowell's story didn't end with Hurricane Harvey, but her legacy lives on in the lives she touched and the children she loved more than anything in the world. May 5th, 2009. A date that would forever change a quiet suburban community and shatter the illusion of safety that so many families take for granted. What started as a routine morning would quickly transform into one of the most shocking and disturbing crime scenes that seasoned investigators had ever encountered. Picture this. You're living in what appears to be the perfect American neighborhood. Tree-lined streets, well-maintained homes, children playing in front yards. The kind of place where people still wave to their neighbors and leave their doors unlocked. Where the biggest worry might be whether the kids remembered their homework or if dinner would be ready on time. But sometimes, evil hides behind the most ordinary facades. Sometimes, the person you trust most becomes the very person you should fear. And sometimes, the warning signs are literally written on the wall. This is the story of a family that seemed to have everything: a devoted mother, 2 young boys with bright futures ahead of them, and a father who worked in security, protecting others for a living. It's also the story of how quickly that perfect life can crumble when secrets, lies, and obsessions collide in the most devastating way possible. The morning began like countless others in Columbia, Illinois, a small community just outside St. Louis, where neighbors knew each other by name and children rode their bikes safely through quiet subdivisions. It was the kind of place where violent crime seemed impossible, where families moved to escape the dangers of city life. Christopher Coleman had left his house that morning around 5:40, heading to the gym as part of his regular routine. His wife Sherry and their 2 sons, 11-year-old Garrett and 9-year-old Gavin, were still sleeping peacefully in their beds. Or at least, that's what everyone believed at the time. By 7 in the morning, Chris was trying to reach his family by phone. When nobody answered, concern began to creep in. After all, Sherry should have been awake by then, getting the boys ready for school, going through the familiar morning rituals that define family life. What happened next would expose a web of deception so twisted and cruel that it would challenge everything this community thought they knew about the people living among them. Detective Justin Barlow lived just across the street from the Coleman family. For 5 years, he had been their neighbor, watching their children grow, exchanging pleasantries over backyard fences. When Chris called that morning, asking someone to check on his family, Barlow had no idea he was about to walk into a nightmare. The house looked normal from the outside. Nothing seemed out of place. The kind of suburban home you'd see in any middle-class neighborhood across America. But appearances, as we're about to discover, can be devastatingly deceiving. Barlow approached the front door first, peering through windows, looking for any sign of the family inside. When that revealed nothing, he made his way around to the basement area. That's when he noticed something that would prove to be crucial to understanding how this horror unfolded. A basement window was open, not just unlocked, but actually open, in a house where the family had been receiving death threats, where security should have been paramount. This detail would later raise serious questions about what really happened that night. The detective entered through the basement, making his way up the stairs toward the main floor of the house. The first thing that hit him wasn't what he saw, but what he smelled. The sharp, acrid scent of spray paint hung heavy in the air, creating an atmosphere of dread before he even understood why. As he reached the main floor and turned toward the kitchen area, Barlow encountered something that would haunt him for the rest of his career. Scrawled across the walls in red spray paint were messages that seemed torn from the darkest corners of human imagination. Words like "punished" stared back at him, written in what appeared to be the hand of someone consumed by rage and hatred. These weren't random acts of vandalism. These messages had a purpose, a meaning that would become clear as the investigation unfolded. They were meant to tell a story, to point investigators in a specific direction, to create a narrative that would explain the unspeakable acts that had taken place in this suburban home. But Detective Barlow's discovery was far from over. Following the trail of disturbing messages, he made his way upstairs to the bedrooms where the family should have been sleeping safely. What he found there would shake this small community to its core and launch one of the most intensive investigations in the region's history. The scene upstairs was one of calculated brutality, masked by an attempt to stage something else entirely. 3 lives had been taken during the night, each victim found in their own bedroom, each having met their end in the place where they should have felt most secure. Sherry Coleman, 31 years old, was discovered in the master bedroom. Her 2 young sons, Garrett and Gavin, were found in their respective rooms, their lives cut short before they had barely begun to live them. The method used to end their lives was particularly disturbing, suggesting an intimate knowledge of the victims and a level of planning that went far beyond a random act of violence. But perhaps most chilling of all were the additional messages left throughout the house. More spray-painted words that seemed designed to tell a specific story about who might have committed these acts and why. Messages that would initially lead investigators down one path, only to have the evidence eventually point in a completely different direction. The phrase, "You have paid," was found leading up the staircase, as if marking a trail toward the bedrooms where the victims lay. It was a message that suggested retribution, that these deaths were somehow justified in the mind of whoever wrote those words. As word spread through the neighborhood that morning, the peaceful suburban community of Columbia was transformed into something resembling a war zone. Police cars, ambulances, and crime scene investigators descended on what had been a quiet residential street. Neighbors emerged from their homes, many still in their pajamas, trying to understand what could have happened to the family they all knew and respected. The Coleman family had seemed to embody everything that made this community special. Chris worked in security for a prominent religious organization, providing protection for high-profile events and traveling around the world in service of his faith. Sherry was a devoted mother who had put her own career aside to focus on raising their two boys. Garrett and Gavin were the kind of children that made adults smile when they saw them playing in the front yard. Polite, well-mannered, always ready to help a neighbor or lend a hand with yard work, they were active in local sports, did well in school, and seemed to have unlimited potential ahead of them. This was not the kind of family that anyone would expect to become victims of such brutal violence. They were pillars of their community, respected by neighbors, and seemingly living the American dream in a place where dreams were supposed to come true safely. But as investigators would soon discover, beneath the surface of this perfect family portrait lay secrets that would shock everyone who thought they knew the Colemans. Secrets about relationships, about deception, and about a plan so methodical and cruel that it would challenge everything people believed about human nature. The death threats that had been arriving at the Coleman home for months suddenly took on new significance. Were these murders the result of Chris's work in security? Had someone targeted his family as a way to get to the prominent religious figure he protected? Or was there something else entirely at play here? As investigators began piecing together the timeline of that horrific morning, questions started mounting faster than answers. The major case squad was called in immediately, bringing together 25 of the most experienced detectives from across the region. This wasn't just another crime scene. This was something that would test every skill they had developed over years of investigating the darkest aspects of human behavior. The house itself became a puzzle that investigators would spend weeks trying to solve. Every room told part of a story, but the pieces didn't quite fit together the way they should have. The basement window that had been left open raised immediate red flags. Here was a family that had been living under the shadow of death threats for months. Yet their home had been left vulnerable to exactly the kind of intrusion they should have been guarding against. Christopher Coleman was brought to the police station that morning, not as a suspect, but as a grieving husband and father who needed to help investigators understand what might have happened to his family. The image he presented was one of absolute devastation. A man whose world had just collapsed around him, who couldn't comprehend how such evil could have touched his loved ones. But experienced detectives know that grief can manifest in many different ways. Some people become hysterical, others withdraw completely. Some ask endless questions about what happened and how their loved ones died. Chris Coleman's reaction fell into none of these typical categories, and that began to concern the investigators who were trying to help him. During those first crucial hours of questioning, Coleman seemed oddly detached from the horror that had befallen his family. He never asked about the specific details of how his wife and children had died. He didn't demand to know what evidence had been found or what leads investigators were pursuing. For a man whose family had just been brutally murdered, his lack of curiosity struck the detectives as unusual. The investigation quickly expanded beyond the confines of Columbia, Illinois. If these murders were connected to Coleman's work in security, then the suspect pool could include anyone from around the world who might have harbored resentment against the religious organization he protected. Investigators began tracking down individuals who had sent threatening emails or made hostile comments about the ministry's work. It was painstaking detective work that involved following leads across multiple states and even international boundaries. Every person who had ever expressed anger or frustration had to be located and their whereabouts verified for the night of the murders. It was the kind of investigation that could take months or even years to complete thoroughly. But while that global search was underway, investigators were also looking more closely at the evidence found within the Coleman home itself. The spray-painted messages that had initially seemed to point toward an outsider with a grudge began revealing details that didn't quite match the narrative they appeared to tell. The handwriting analysis became a crucial component of the investigation. Experts were brought in to examine every letter, every stroke of the spray paint that had been used to create those menacing messages. What they discovered would eventually become one of the most damning pieces of evidence in the entire case. Meanwhile, the community of Colombia was struggling to come to terms with the reality that such violence could occur in their peaceful neighborhood. Parents began walking their children to school instead of letting them go alone. Neighbors started locking doors that had remained open for years. The sense of security that had drawn so many families to this area was shattered in a single morning. Local churches organized prayer vigils and support groups for families who were having trouble explaining to their children how something so terrible could happen to people they knew. The psychological impact rippled through the entire community, affecting not just those who knew the Colemans personally, but anyone who had ever felt safe in their own home. As the investigation progressed, detectives began uncovering aspects of Christopher Coleman's life that painted a very different picture than the one his neighbors and community members had known. Phone records, computer files, and financial documents started revealing a complex web of relationships and motivations that had nothing to do with religious extremists or international threats. The death threats that had been arriving at the Coleman home for months suddenly took on a different significance as investigators dug deeper into their origins. Computer forensics experts were brought in to trace the digital footprints of these threatening messages, and what they discovered would turn the entire investigation on its head. Every email, every letter, every threatening communication was subjected to the most advanced analysis available. The technology existed to trace these messages back to their source, to determine not just where they had come from, but what devices had been used to create them. The results of this analysis would prove to be absolutely devastating to the narrative that had initially seemed so obvious. As weeks turned into months, the investigation revealed layer after layer of deception that went far beyond anything investigators had initially imagined. This wasn't just a case of a family being targeted by strangers. This was something far more personal, far more calculated, and far more disturbing than anyone in Colombia could have anticipated. The perfect family that neighbors had admired was revealed to be struggling with issues that nobody outside their home had ever suspected. Financial pressures, relationship problems, and personal conflicts that had been carefully hidden behind a facade of suburban normalcy. The kind of problems that millions of families face, but that in this case had escalated to unthinkable consequences. Detective work of this magnitude requires not just technical expertise, but also the ability to understand human psychology and motivation. Investigators had to piece together not just what had happened on that terrible night, but why someone would be driven to commit such acts against people who should have been able to trust them completely. The evidence was mounting, but it was pointing in a direction that nobody had wanted to consider. Sometimes the most dangerous person in your life is someone you see every day, someone you trust implicitly, someone who knows your routines and your vulnerabilities better than any stranger ever could. The breakthrough came when investigators discovered that Tara Lynch, a woman from Florida who had claimed to be merely a friend, was actually much more than that. Phone records revealed hundreds of calls and text messages between her and Christopher Coleman. Credit card statements showed trips they had taken together. Hotel reservations painted a picture of a relationship that had been going on for months, hidden from everyone in Colombia. What made this discovery even more shocking was the connection between Tara and the Coleman family. She wasn't just some random woman that Chris had met through work. She was actually one of Sherry's old friends from high school. The ultimate betrayal was unfolding before investigators' eyes. The timeline was becoming clearer with each piece of evidence they uncovered. The affair had begun in the fall of 2008, just months before the death threats started arriving at the Coleman home. The connection between these two events was too significant to ignore. Computer forensics revealed something that would prove absolutely crucial to the case. Those threatening emails that had initially pointed investigators toward international suspects had actually originated from Christopher Coleman's own laptop. The account that had been used to send them was created using information that only someone with intimate knowledge of the Coleman family would have known. The spray paint used to write those menacing messages on the walls had been purchased at a local hardware store, and the receipt bore Christopher Coleman's signature. The same man who had reported receiving death threats had actually been the one creating them all along. But perhaps the most damning evidence came from an unexpected source. Tara Lynch had been keeping detailed records of her relationship with Coleman, including photos and videos that contradicted everything he had told investigators about the timeline of their affair. Among these photos was one that would ultimately seal Coleman's fate. A picture of the couple kissing, with a timestamp showing it had been taken weeks before Coleman claimed their relationship had even begun. When confronted with this evidence, his carefully constructed story began falling apart completely. The motive became crystal clear once investigators understood the full scope of Coleman's deception. He had been living a double life for months, promising Tara that he would divorce his wife and start a new life with her. They had even discussed wedding dates and future plans together, but there was a problem. Coleman's job with the religious ministry came with strict moral guidelines. Adultery could cost him his position and his substantial salary. He needed Sherry to be the one to file for divorce, to make it appear that the marriage had failed through no fault of his own. When Sherry discovered the affair but refused to divorce him, Coleman found himself trapped. He couldn't marry Tara without losing his job, but he couldn't continue the deception indefinitely either. The pressure was mounting from all sides, and he began planning what he believed would be the perfect solution. The death threats served multiple purposes in his scheme. They established a pattern of outside danger that would provide an obvious suspect when the murders occurred. They also gave him an excuse to install security cameras in his home, which he could later claim had malfunctioned or been tampered with. On the night of May 4th, Coleman put his plan into action. While his family slept, he methodically ended their lives, then spent time creating the crime scene that would support his story. The spray-painted messages, the open window, the missing security footage. Every detail had been calculated to point investigators away from him. The autopsy results revealed the true horror of what had happened that night. Sherry had fought for her life, sustaining injuries that indicated a violent struggle. Her 2 young sons had been killed in their beds, never having a chance to defend themselves or escape. Physical evidence on Coleman's body told the story of that final confrontation with his wife. Scratches on his arms matched the defensive wounds found on Sherry's hands. DNA evidence linked him directly to the crime scene, despite his attempts to clean up afterward. When Christopher Coleman was finally arrested and charged with 3 counts of first-degree murder, the community's shock was palpable. This was a man they had trusted, respected, and admired. The revelation that he had been capable of such calculated evil shattered their faith in their own judgment about human nature. The trial that followed would captivate the nation and force everyone to confront uncomfortable truths about the capacity for deception that exists within seemingly ordinary people. The evidence presented painted a picture of a man so consumed by selfishness and obsession that he was willing to destroy everything and everyone who stood in the way of his desires. In the end, justice was served. Christopher Coleman was convicted on all counts and sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. But for the community of Colombia, for Sherry's family and friends, and for everyone who had known and loved Garrett and Gavin, no verdict could ever truly heal the wounds left behind. The writing had indeed been on the wall, but not in the way anyone had initially understood. The real message wasn't in those spray-painted threats or staged crime scene elements. It was in the pattern of lies, the web of deception, and the cold calculation that had led a father and husband to become the very monster his family should have been protected from. This case serves as a chilling reminder that evil doesn't always announce itself with obvious warning signs. Sometimes it lives quietly among us, wearing familiar faces and maintaining respectable facades, waiting for the right moment to reveal its true nature. The most dangerous predators are often those who know us best, who understand our vulnerabilities, and who have earned our trust through years of careful deception. The community of Columbia eventually began to heal, but they never forgot the lessons learned from this tragedy. They created memorials to honor Sherry, Garrett, and Gavin, ensuring that their memory would live on long after the horror of their deaths had faded. And they remained vigilant, understanding now that safety isn't guaranteed simply by living in the right neighborhood or surrounding yourself with the right people. The writing on the wall had told a story, but it wasn't the story anyone expected to read.